there, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Poppy, and today is part 2 of my Timeless read-through. Last time we read chapters 1 through 5, and today we will be reading chapters 6 through 10. So if you haven't watched part 1, I suggest you go back and watch that, because this is not going to make any sense. So once again, this is Timeless by Alexandra_Emerson. Chapter 6. Quote, "There was a look in his eyes I had never seen before, and it took me a few moments to recognize it for what it was. Remorse. 'I don't deserve you,' he said, half defeated, half hopeful. It was the most honest thing he'd ever said to me, and he was right. He didn't deserve me. Not by a long shot, but he had me nonetheless." Langliev. Present time, October 2000. Draco's time, same as present. Draco Malfoy. Draco was straightening his tie in the mirror when he heard Astoria flew into his flat. He checked his appearance one last time and went to meet her. "You look stunning," he said as he took in her dark red ball gown and elaborate hairstyle. It wasn't a lie. She looked gorgeous, but he wished she wasn't wearing so much makeup. He preferred her without it, though he knew better than to say so. "You don't look so bad yourself." She approached him and placed a soft kiss on his lips, holding back so she wouldn't smudge her lipstick. "Your mother's Halloween ball was one of my favorite events growing up. I've been looking forward to this for months, and I'm sure I'm not the only one. It's one of the most anticipated events of the year." Draco nodded absently as Granger's words echoed through his mind. "Clinging to a surname that everyone in the wizarding world despises." "Let's go." Draco offered Astoria his arm and apparated them to Malfoy Manor. His mother and father were waiting in the drawing room to greet their guests as they arrived. His mother went to Astoria, and they started complimenting each other's dresses, while his father nodded in greeting and began thoroughly scanning Draco's appearance. Draco was pretty sure his father knew about the time travel. He always took time to study Draco when he saw him, which made Draco think he was trying to decide if he was from a different time. The more he thought about that first day, the more he realized his father must have watched him transform into an older version of himself while they were battling the dark artifacts. Maybe future Draco had even explained the situation to his father. Draco couldn't be sure, but he knew it wasn't an accident that all the books on time had suddenly disappeared from the library. But he wasn't ready to talk to his father about it, and was relieved Lucius hadn't brought it up either. "You look well, Draco." "Thank you, Father. I have a board meeting at Hendrix Corporation next week if you'd like to join me. You remember Harold Hendrix. He's the one who is interested in setting up a wizarding-run bank. I remember, Father. Your hesitation in admitting to Father that you'd rather track investments than serve on boards. Fuck. He knew he never should have read that damn letter. Allow me the details and I'll attend." Draco ended with a curt nod, and then went to greet his mother. "Did you guys hear about Pansy?" Draco pulled his attention away from the bat he'd been watching fly around the ballroom. "She's marrying some Bulgarian bloke," Daphne continued. "Oh, good for her," Astoria chimed in. Blaise smirked at her. "I heard the whole wedding is happening in such a rush because Pansy's pregnant. I don't even think she likes the bloke, but her mother is forcing her to go through with the wedding." "How do you always know this random shit?" Theo asked. Blaise shrugged. "Just keeping up with an old friend. Where's the harm in that?" "Right," Draco cut in, "because you and Pansy were so close. Those two were constantly at each other's throats in school. It had nearly driven Draco mad." "No, you're right. The closest person to Pansy here is you, Draco. Pity you two don't keep in touch anymore." Draco narrowed his eyes at Blaise, but didn't rise to the bait. Draco and Pansy had dated through most of 5th and 6th year, with occasional breaks, but in 7th year he'd broken it off. They'd started dating again following the end of the war, but it had ended terribly after just 3 months. She'd complained endlessly about his depression, and he'd been disgusted that she wasn't more affected by the war. Ultimately, she cheated on him, which had hurt him more than he'd expected. Draco had been so wounded that he uncharacteristically reached out to Blaise and Daphne for support. They'd been kind enough at the time, but Draco should have known better. Here Blaise was, using what he knew of Draco's breakup to get a laugh. This was why Draco tried to keep his distance. "The detachment between you and your friends that you can't figure out how to remedy." Draco turned to Astoria and pulled her to the dance floor. She placed her drink on a passing tray, then turned to him and smiled. "Ignore Blaise, he's an ass," she whispered before kissing his cheek. Draco nodded uncomfortably. "Great, so Astoria knew about the whole Pansy thing too." Daphne must have told her. He didn't know if he was upset about that or not. He figured he should have been the one to tell Astoria, but he found it nearly impossible to talk to her about anything meaningful. What was his problem? Astoria was kind, beautiful, and clever. She was a good match for him, and his parents approved of her. He admitted that was because her family was part of the Sacred 28. He didn't think his parents knew very much about Astoria, apart from the fact that she was well-mannered and clearly loved their son. But did he love her back? Did it even matter? He'd planned to propose by the end of the year, but that was just months away now. The unknown source of apprehension every time you consider proposing to Astoria. Let's get out of here. He bent and whispered in her ear. Draco, we've been here less than an hour. You stay then. He leaned in and kissed her forehead. I'll stop by your house tomorrow. He could see she was disappointed, but before he could protest, he turned for the hall. He had to get out of here. As soon as he left the ballroom, he heard his father call out for him. Draco turned and saw Lucius studying him again. Father? Is anything the matter? I'm feeling ill. Tell Mother the ball was spectacular as always. I'll see you next week. Draco rushed to the drawing room, then hesitated in front of the fireplace and went to his old bedroom instead. He lit a few candles on the dresser and rummaged through the top drawer until he found the ring box. He opened it and studied the engagement ring in the candlelight. He remembered what he'd told Granger about this ring. I'm planning to use the Malfoy ring when I propose, and the fact that I didn't give it to you proves there's something off between us. It was true he'd been surprised to see her wearing a different ring. Why wouldn't he give her this? This was the ring meant for his future wife. There was a significance to using a different one, he was sure of it, but he couldn't figure out what it was. This is my life. This is my life. This is my life, he repeated in his mind. If he wanted to, he could take this ring and give it to Astoria. He knew she'd accept it. Then he wouldn't end up married to Granger in the future. But there was something holding him back, and for the first time in a long while, he finally had the words to describe it. The fear that no one in the world will ever truly understand you or want to. Lonely. Unmoored. Present time, May 2004. Draco's time, November 2000. Draco Malfoy. A week later, the feeling of vertigo came over Draco as he read the prophet in the kitchen of his flat. When he realized what was happening, he didn't know if he was upset about it or relieved. He didn't particularly want to see Granger, but he also wanted to get as far away from his present as possible. He appeared in an unfamiliar room. It took him a while to realize he was in a small, open-air house on a beach. He took a deep breath, then peered into the adjacent room and paused at the sight in front of him. Granger was across the room, watching the sunset from an open window. She was wearing a long, see-through silk dress over a swimsuit, and her hair was billowing down her back in loose ringlets. The way the sunlight streamed into the window around her lit her up like a deity. There was only one word to describe how she looked right then. Breathtaking. When she looked back at him and smiled, it was clear she'd been expecting him, and Draco's heart started beating hard in his chest. He'd never seen her looking so relaxed and content. It took him a moment to find his voice. We're on holiday? She nodded, and her eyes flashed with a hint of sadness. Yeah, so you can't run off this time. Right, I've done that already? What's the date? When she looked up at him, he could recall her expression from the last time he'd seen her. Innocent, hurt, confused. May 2004. It's our honeymoon. Draco's stomach clenched, and he swore under his breath. He may not want to marry this woman, but he also didn't want to ruin her honeymoon. She'd done nothing to deserve that. This wasn't the Granger who had been cruel to him. Well, not yet, at least. How long into the trip are we? We arrived this afternoon. This is our first night. Draco hitched his breath, and Hermione smirked back at him. I mean, it's not our wedding night or anything, and even if it were, we've had sex before. Draco looked away from her amused expression, suddenly feeling very uncomfortable. I usually can't get you to shut up about sex, she muttered under her breath. Draco continued to keep his eyes away from her and focused on a palm tree outside the window. He could feel her walking closer to him. Her hand unexpectedly touched his face and turned it so he was facing her. She looked into his eyes. You don't love me, she stated. You don't even like me. Her big brown eyes continued to bore into his. Then she took a step back and dropped her head. Why not? Draco sighed. I don't know you. How many times have we met so far? Draco started counting in his head. 5 times in the future, and in my time, 2. You seem nice, Granger, but I don't want to be forced into this. I hate feeling like I'm being forced into things. Is that because of the war? Fuck, leave me alone, Draco groaned, turning away from her. He began pacing the room. So I guess your Draco told you things, but that's, as far as I'm concerned, that's not me. Then why don't you tell me? Draco stopped pacing and looked back at her. About the war? Granger shrugged. Sure, why not? I'm sure you already know. I don't, actually. I know the gist, obviously, but no details. We mostly avoided that topic. I learned in the middle of a drinking game that we've discussed it, but that hasn't happened for me yet. Draco walked over to her and studied her face to see if she was lying, but she looked sincere. You married me without knowing everything I did in the war? That actually explained quite a lot. She shrugged and smirked back at him. I learned in that same drinking game that you haven't killed anyone, but you did torture first years. What the fuck kind of drinking game was that? A memorable one, she sighed. I can tell you about the war from my perspective if you're interested. How have we not already had this conversation? She shrugged again and walked to the doorway. We're not a normal couple, Draco. No fucking shit, he muttered under his breath. Then he narrowed his eyes at her. Why do you want to know? Honestly, Draco, I don't. I'd prefer to forget everything that happened at the war, but that's not a realistic expectation. She sighed again and leaned her forehead against the doorframe. But I also don't want you to sit here and yell at me, and I can tell a part of you wants to talk about it. She turned her head to look at him and gave him a pretty smile. You told me once you used to believe the future you saw with me was an alternate reality that would never come to pass. Well, if that's what you believe, then what's the harm in talking to me? Draco shook his head and moved his eyes to the brilliant sky outside the window. What if you change your mind about marrying me? That's future Draco's problem, not yours. You've never talked to anyone about it, have you? What do you think? He snapped. She smiled again. There's a poem. I like poetry. I'm not sure if you know that about me yet. Anyway, it goes like this. Imagine meeting someone who wanted to learn your past, not to punish you, but to understand how you needed to be loved. That's what I'm offering here, Draco, if you want it. She turned to go outside, but then said over her shoulder, You can do what you want. I really don't care. If you want to talk, I'm here for you. If not, that's fine too. But please, no yelling or dueling. She walked out of sight, and Draco went to the window and watched her settle onto a bench just outside the house facing the sun, which was almost completely set. He watched it until it left the sky, then waited until all of the remaining light was gone from the horizon before joining her outside. Granger was right. There was no real harm in talking to her. He didn't think this future would ever come to pass, and maybe she would decide to leave him after he admitted everything. That was what he wanted, wasn't it? And he'd always been curious about this confiding in people thing. Astoria was constantly nagging him about getting things off his chest, and even Potter went to a mind healer. He'd admitted it in an interview once. This was a pretty risk-free way to test out the theory and see if talking really did help somehow, though he was doubtful it would change anything. Draco sat next to Granger on the bench, and they both watched the ocean in silence for several moments before she started to talk. There are 5 moments from the war that have stayed with me, and I still have nightmares about all of them. Most of the rest of the war is a blur. The first one was the day I obliviated my parents. She looked over at him, and her eyes were incredibly sad and sparkling with tears. I wanted to hide them, but they wouldn't go away. They didn't truly comprehend the threat. So I removed all memories of myself from their minds and convinced them to change their names and move to Australia. Draco had no idea she'd made such a sacrifice. Were you able to reverse it? She nodded, as she looked down and he saw a tear fall onto the ground. They're back to normal now, though they've decided to continue living in Australia. That act, it destroyed our relationship. But I'd do it again. She took a deep breath and continued. The second was when Ron left me and Harry during our hunt for the Horcruxes. I'm not sure how much you know about all that. She looked over at him and he shrugged. Just what they reported in the papers. The paper made it sound glamorous, like we knew exactly what we were doing, but it wasn't like that at all. We had limited clues and spent months nearly starved and at a loss for what to do next. Ron was fed up and he left for a while. It broke my heart, and Harry's too. And the third thing, well, it was that day at Malfoy Manor. I don't need to give you the details. You were there. Draco gulped and remained silent. Fourth was when I walked into the Great Hall and saw it lined with bodies. Lupin, Tonks. Her voice cracked and tears were streaming down her face. Fred, Lavender, Colin, all of them. I knew people were dying in the war, and I saw them fall in the battle, but lined up like that? She cut off again and dipped her head. She began sobbing quietly. He knew exactly how she felt. He remembered the same scene. She cried for a few moments, and Draco was at a loss of what to do. He considered touching her a few times, but didn't know if that would make it better or worse. Eventually, she sat back up and continued talking, occasionally rubbing tears away with the bottom of her dress. And the last was when Hagrid was carrying Harry's supposedly dead body out of the forest. I was so sure we'd lost, and that despair, it was all-consuming. When I think of that moment, even now, it all comes flooding back to me. She turned and looked over at Draco, and he could see her eyes were wet with tears, but she still looked beautiful. It's funny, none of those had Voldemort in them. I mean, it all happened because of him. She looked back at the ocean. Harry obviously has more memories with him in them, and I suspect you do too, but, well, those are my ghosts. It was a while before Draco started talking. When he finally did, he was grateful that she was looking at the ocean and not at him. I have more than 5. There are probably 15 or 20 scenes that my brain cycles through when it comes to nightmares. I've never counted. Draco remembered how she'd helped him with his nightmare in the future. Had she done that for him yet? He continued talking through his memories, taking the mark, the first time he was tortured in the summer before 6th year, training with Bellatrix, being forced to go on raids. He told her about the prisoners who were brought back to the manor and how he tried to help them. How, occasionally, for the ones he knew had been forced to watch their loved ones die, he removed those memories from their mind so they wouldn't have to continuously play through them. But everyone he'd tried to help had eventually been killed. He talked about Hogwarts in his 7th year and how it was what he imagined Muggle hell to be like. When he got to the parts of his story when he was forced to torture others, she finally looked over at him. He'd expected to see a look of disgust, but she looked concerned and placed a comforting hand on his leg. He remembered the poem she'd quoted earlier. Imagine meeting someone who wanted to learn your past, not to punish you, but to understand how you needed to be loved. This witch loved him. He was sure of it. He wasn't sure how he felt about it, but he knew it was true. Finally, after recounting the final battle and his relief at watching the Dark Lord killed, he stopped talking. She removed her hand from his leg, and they stared at the moon for a long while. He wondered if she would say something or just leave, having finally got the information she wanted out of him. He considered the differences in their experiences. She'd had terrible things done to her, but had done absolutely nothing wrong. He, on the other hand, his inability to act was despicable. How could she possibly want to be with someone like him? You just listed facts, Draco, but you left out all of the emotion. He shook his head. I'm not a Gryffindor, Granger. I don't sit around talking about my feelings. I know. Just, if you could sum up the whole war in one emotion, which would it be? Draco looked back at her but remained silent. When he didn't answer, she pressed. Fear? Apprehension? Disgust? Looking into her eyes was like taking a dose of Veritaserum. Eventually, Draco responded with remorse. He looked away from her and felt a single tear slide down his cheek. He felt completely wrecked. He thought talking about this stuff was supposed to make him feel better, but he couldn't recall a time he'd ever felt this bad. A warm hand touched his cheek. He closed his eyes as she pulled him to face her. She stroked her thumb along his cheek to wipe the tear away, then whispered, I know you thought I'd changed my mind about being with you, but, well, I think I'll keep you, even with all of that. Draco hadn't realized how much he'd wanted her acceptance until he had it. He opened his eyes and saw that, impossibly, she was smiling at him. He couldn't help but return it, and they sat there watching each other until she shivered and pulled her hand back to rub her arms. I can summon you a blanket. It's so cute. He moved to pull his wand from his pocket, but she just shook her head and leaned against his side. Draco knew he should push her off, but it was the absolute last thing his body wanted to do. Instead, he lifted his arm and wrapped it around her as she snuggled closer. You have a girlfriend, he reminded himself, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't keep Astoria in his thoughts. Not tonight. As he looked back at the moon, All his thoughts were consumed by Granger. He replayed their conversation, then started to recall conversations they'd had during other time jumps. I know what I signed up for, but sometimes I think it's too hard. I hate you from all your times. I hate this. You think this matches the plan I had for myself? A husband who's constantly disappearing, then coming back in a different form and insulting me? All this talk of how Draco Malfoy could have possibly ended up with Hermione Granger, when the real question is, how the hell did I end up with you? He'd been so busy hating her, he hadn't really stopped to listen to what she'd been saying. She would come to regret being with him, and it made complete sense. He was awful for her. He felt a little bad for the Granger in his arms. And he felt sad, too, for his future self. But that future Draco still chose to go to the past and try to convince Granger to love him, even knowing how she'd come to feel. Did they get past it all? Draco was suddenly worried about them, though he'd never allow himself to consider them a real couple. He remembered the first time jump, but he'd never checked the date on that, so he didn't know if it was before or after all the times Granger had been upset with him. Draco spent most of his time trying to forget that first time jump, and as he tried to recall it now, the details were blurry, but he remembered she'd clearly loved him and said something about it all being worth it. He realized he was absently stroking her arm and stopped, then focused on her breathing against his chest. He looked down and saw she was asleep. He should take her back inside, but he stayed put, enjoying the feeling of her against him. He remembered another conversation they'd had, when he'd pointed out that when he went to the future, she never tried to woo him. He'd have to amend that now. She'd done an excellent job of trying to change his opinion of her tonight, though she'd been incredibly subtle about it. Maybe in some other life, she could have been a Slytherin. Present time, November 2000. Draco's time, same as present. Draco Malfoy. When Draco returned to his time, he went straight to Malfoy Manor. He checked his father's study for inhabitants and let out a sigh of relief when the spell showed it was empty. He walked over to the pensieve and carefully removed it from the shelf, then stared at it for a few moments, reconsidering his plan. Draco sat on the chair, touched his wand to his temple, and dropped the memory of his first time jump into the basin. He watched it swirl around for a few moments before finally working up the courage to go inside. The next moment, he was at the house in London, and Granger was crying in the hall. He watched her fling herself onto him and crouched down next to Memory Draco so he could see her face clearly. She was older than all the other Grangers, he was sure of it. Or maybe that's just what he wanted to believe. He'd always assumed this memory was just over 6 years in the future, to match with the number of times he'd turned the time turner before it broke. And that would fit. It would make this the latest jump he'd completed to date. I love you, Draco. I know you have no idea what's going on, but I love you, I love you, I love you. What do you know? What is going on? His memory self asked. It was worth it, she continued. All the tears, all the fights, the uncertainty, all of it. I'd do it all again. She looked incredibly sad, but seemed determined to get through her speech. Draco wondered why. Surely she knew the Draco she was talking to had no idea what was going on. Who are you talking to, Granger? You asked me once who I loved most. All of them. I love you regardless of time or your memories or whatever is going on around us. She placed her hand on Memory Draco's chest. I love your soul, Draco. Even now. I know you hate me, and maybe you think this is a bit repulsive, but I still love you, and I promise I'll never stop. Draco looked into her eyes, and the raw expression of love there was intoxicating. Memory Draco stood and left, and Draco pulled himself out of the pensieve. He braced his hands on the desk for a long time and replayed everything he'd seen, given what he knew now. They got over it. They obviously went through some sort of rough patch, maybe caused by his past self jumping forward and insulting Granger, but later she'd forgive him. It was worth it. All the tears, all the fights, the uncertainty, all of it. I'd do it all again. You don't care about these people, he tried to remind himself. They aren't real. Hermione is the answer to every question that plagues you right now. She will fix it all if you let her. You won't feel lonely or unmoored anymore, but you need to give her a fucking chance. Draco didn't know how long he stayed there, warring with himself in his mind. By the end, he'd solved nothing, but knew something had shifted. He jumped when he heard a noise outside the door and floated the pensieve back onto the shelf. He was surprised to find his eyes were wet and quickly wiped them, then checked the hall. It was empty. Maybe it had just been a house elf. He rushed back to his flat and tried to busy himself with investments and star charts, but he couldn't get Hermione's loving expression out of his mind. Granger, he corrected. Her name is Granger. Present time, November 2000. Draco's time, May 2004. Hermione Granger. A month later, Malfoy showed up at the cafe again. He approached warily, seeming to pick up on her aloofness. May I sit? Why would you think my thoughts have changed since I last saw you? Right, when you told me you were, cross with me. Hermione frowned. Surely his memory lapses couldn't be that bad. He must remember the cold look he'd given her in Diagon Alley and their subsequent conversation when she'd asked him to leave her alone. You're fine when we're alone, but when everyone else is around, you act like I'm scum, not worthy to be around wonderful pureblood Draco Malfoy. It's not that, really. I'm just... He paused, looking for the right word. Moody. It's hereditary, he added with a roguish smile, which she tried to ignore. Hermione narrowed her eyes at him, but didn't protest when he took the seat opposite her. They sat in silence as she finished her lunch. When she finally set her fork down, he asked, Are you finished eating? She looked down at her empty plate, as if that should be answer enough. Okay, let's go. Malfoy stood up and started pulling his jacket on. Where? Hermione asked, remaining in her seat. For ice cream. It's winter. Autumn, technically, and we're wizards. That's what warming charms are for. He pulled her jacket from the back of her chair and held it out for her. You seem like the kind of person that likes ice cream no matter the weather. She glared back at him, wondering how he could have possibly guessed that. She decided to go with him, more out of curiosity than anything, and put her arms through the jacket he was holding out for her. Hermione followed him into a dark alley, and when she saw him start to pull out his wand, she stopped him. There's an ice cream shop just up the road. He shrugged. I like Florine Fortescue's. Meet you there. He disapparated before she had a chance to protest. She sighed and pulled out her wand, then appeared a few seconds later in Diagon Alley. Malfoy was several feet away from her, leaning casually against the wall. She saw he'd already transfigured his clothes back into robes. What are you doing? She asked. Showing you I'm not ashamed to be seen with you. Now come on. He opened the door to the ice cream parlor, then held it as she hesitated on the street. She wasn't sure she wanted this strange friendship publicized. She wasn't exactly ashamed of him, but meeting together in Diagon Alley, especially with how recognizable they both were, was almost as bad as taking an ad out in the Daily Prophet. Hermione? Malfoy was holding the door open, with an annoyingly smug expression on his face. She finally went inside, then gave her order and let him pay. She noticed he tipped nearly 200%, and wondered if he felt guilty for what had happened to Florine in the war, or if he'd always tipped an obnoxious amount because he could. Instead of handing her her ice cream cone, he took both cones and went for a table near the window. She followed him and hesitated before sitting down. Seriously? We're going to sit here? During lunch hour? He smirked as he pulled the chair out for her. My, Hermione, are you ashamed to be seen with an ex-Death Eater? Worried it will sully your pristine reputation? His tone was light, his gray eyes sparkling with mirth. Fine, she grumbled, taking her cone out of his hand and sitting down in the chair. They ate in silence as Hermione tried her best not to look out the window. She wondered what Ron would say if he found out. She'd admitted about Malfoy's apology that night of the Quidditch match, but hadn't told him she'd been meeting Malfoy at the cafe for months since. Eventually, Malfoy asked her about what she was reading, and she got caught up in the conversation and forgot to be worried about people walking by. As she was finishing her cone, a knock on the glass pulled her out of her argument with Malfoy over the merits of Shakespeare. Hermione saw Neville waving at her from the other side. He motioned for her to go outside, and she looked back at Malfoy and blushed, then went to see what Neville wanted. Hermione, are you okay? Of course, Neville. Why do you ask? He cocked his head toward the window where Malfoy was probably smirking, and she sighed. Yes, I am, friends with Draco Malfoy. Wow, okay. I should get back. Right, I just wanted to check. I understand, thanks. When she returned to the table, Malfoy was grinning widely. She rolled her eyes. They'd lost the flow of their earlier conversation and sat in silence. Now Ron would definitely find out, and she'd have to explain why she hadn't thought to mention the news of her and Malfoy's friendship before. What's wrong, Hermione? Worried about this getting back to your boyfriend? Of course not, she waved him off. Malfoy looked like he was considering something. He finally seemed to make a decision and asked, Why Weasley, out of all the other blokes? What? He just seems easy. Tell me you didn't just pick him because he was there and was a safe choice. You're better than that. That's none of your business. You barely know me, and you know him even less. Ron is incredible. He is not just there, he's loyal and kind and funny, and I love him. We are great together. He nodded, like he didn't really believe her, then shook his head. I think you can do better. She glared back at him. I'm not interested in your opinion, Malfoy. He shrugged and left shortly after that. She considered his accusation as she watched him walk down the street toward Gringotts. Who was he to judge her relationship with Ron? Talk about picking someone easy. Look at his girlfriend, the perfect pureblood princess. End of chapter. Author's note. I love the part in every Hermione story where Draco's cold heart starts to melt. I couldn't find the original author of the poem Hermione mentions in this scene. It just seems to be quoted all over the internet with no clear source. Okay, and now we are on to chapter 7. Quote, I count his breaths in hours unslept against hours of him I have left. With him lying there, with him unaware, I am out of my depth. Langley F. Present time, December 2000. Draco's time, same as present. Draco Malfoy. Draco was in his flat poring over arithmancy charts when Astoria arrived through the flue. He could tell immediately something was wrong with her. She didn't look angry, but was definitely upset. He closed his notebook and put the quill down, then looked up and waited for her to speak. Tell me honestly, Draco, are you cheating on me with Hermione Granger? Draco's eyes widened and he stood up. No, of course not. His mind immediately recalled that night on the beach last week, though he knew that wasn't what she was talking about. Also, wrapping his arm around another witch hardly counted as cheating. Daphne saw you. Doing what? This was obviously something future Draco had done, and he knew he had to proceed carefully, since he had no idea what had actually happened. What does that mean? You've done so many things with her and want to know specifically what you were caught at? No, Story. Draco sighed and placed his hands on her shoulders. I am not cheating on you. I would never do that. I haven't done anything with her that could be construed as cheating, so I'm confused. He really hoped this was true. Tell me what Daphne saw. Astoria regarded him and eventually sighed and went to sit on the couch. She saw you two eating ice cream together in Diagon Alley. Ice cream? In the winter? And I know that alone isn't a huge deal, she continued. You're obviously allowed to eat ice cream with whoever you please, but coupled with that strange dance you shared a few months ago, and with how distant you've been lately, she trailed off and Draco went to sit next to her on the couch. He took a deep breath. He was annoyed with his future self. If this Draco really was a different version of him, he thought he could count on him to be a little more discreet. That Draco knew he had a girlfriend, and Hermione still had a boyfriend in this time. Granger, stop calling her Hermione. Story. I'm sorry. It really is nothing. Draco flipped through the potential excuses in his mind. I was apologizing to her for, the war and how I treated her in school. Astoria looked down at her hands, and Draco waited for her to respond, but she remained silent. You believe me, right? I'm not cheating. She finally looked up at him and nodded. I believe you. And now that you've apologized, are you finished seeing her? Now it was Draco's turn to look away. He wanted to say yes, but he knew he'd continue to time jump, and his future self would undoubtedly continue to seek Granger out. If he really wanted to end this, he could find Granger and tell her what was going on, but for some reason, Draco couldn't bring himself to do that. Not yet. In the few times we've talked, we've become sort of acquaintances. I might see her again. Nothing romantic, though, of course. Astoria looked sad, but she nodded back at him and leaned her head against the couch. Did you talk to her about the war? Draco nodded. At least now he was being honest. He had talked to Granger about the war, but technically that night on the beach hadn't happened yet. You can talk to me about that stuff too, Draco. Astoria looked back at him, her dark brown eyes pleading. Draco sighed and placed a hand on her leg. I know, it's hard for me. But you can confide in a stranger? Someone you don't even like? She had a point. Why was it easier for him to talk to Granger than his own girlfriend? He knew he should make more of an effort with Astoria if he really intended to marry her. He took a deep breath. I still have a lot of nightmares from the war. But you don't, do you? Is that why you won't talk to me? Because you don't think I went through as much as you did? Draco stayed silent and his heart dropped. He was trying to confide in her, but she was taking it wrong. Did she not see what just that one admission had cost him? Tears welled in her eyes. A lot of the reason I don't have awful memories to relive is because of you. You protected me and Daphne from the Caros, but, well, I didn't know at the time that not being tortured or raped would preclude me from getting to know the real you later on. Draco swore under his breath. That's not what I meant at all. I'm trying... He cut off, frustrated now. Astoria, I'm sorry. I didn't mean that at all. I'm so glad you didn't suffer in the war. He took a deep breath and closed his eyes. He wished he could time jump and have future Draco come finish this conversation. He took a deep breath and used a small amount of occlumency to clear his mind. He felt a warm hand on his face. I'm sorry, Draco. I guess I'm being overly defensive. I'm really sorry you still have nightmares. Do you want to tell me about them? When Draco opened his eyes, Astoria was looking back at him apprehensively. Imagine meeting someone who wanted to learn your past, not to punish you, but to understand how you needed to be loved. Draco realized then that he didn't trust Astoria enough to tell her. He didn't know what she'd do with the information. He raised his hand to her hair and started running his fingers through it. No, Astoria, not now. But, that's why I don't want you to stay over, because of the nightmares. Astoria nodded back at him, and he could tell this small confession was enough for her. She leaned in and placed a kiss on his cheek. He let out a sigh of relief. The awkward conversation was finally over. Draco watched her stand and straighten her skirt before disappearing into his bathroom. He wondered where the conversation had gone wrong. It had flowed so easily with Granger, but the past few minutes with Astoria had been a disaster. A few minutes later, she reappeared. Can I get ready here? Draco looked back at her confused. For the ballet tonight? Have you forgotten? Of course not. Her face fell. I mean, yes, get ready here, and no, I didn't forget. Though that was a lie, he'd completely forgotten. Draco went back to his work, and Astoria joined him at the table, trying to follow along with the arithmancy formulas. He stopped and watched her, amused. Do you want me to explain this to you? Maybe this was a better way to try to include her in his life. He couldn't discuss gruesome details from the war, but he could involve her in his job. It's okay. I've never been great with maths. I just like watching you. She gave him a warm smile, and he forced a smile on his face before focusing back on the charts in front of him. A few hours later, as Draco and Astoria ascended the steps of the theater, they passed by the Weasley girl and Granger. Draco froze at the sight of her. This was the first time he'd seen her since talking through the war, since he'd disappeared before she'd awoken. But this version of her didn't know what they'd shared. He had no idea what to do, and settled for a polite nod before guiding Astoria inside. In the middle of the first act, he excused himself when he felt his head start to spin. He sighed in the hall and hoped his future self wouldn't do anything to further upset Astoria. Then he removed his outer robes and bow tie and placed them on the ground, reasoning it would be easier for his future self if he didn't have to transfigure his current clothes into an entire new set of dress robes. As he was pulled to another time, he wondered when, along the way, he'd stopped hating the other Draco. Present time, December 2000. Draco's time, March 2005. Hermione Granger. When Hermione saw Malfoy and his girlfriend on the steps of the theater, she froze. She wondered how he'd react this time. He looked her up and down, clearly startled to see her too, then gave her a curt nod. She wasn't sure how she felt about the reaction. It wasn't a sneer, but not quite a smile, though there was a hint of familiarity in the gesture. Stop overanalyzing this. It's just Malfoy. I can't believe you two are friends, Ginny muttered. Me neither. Hermione had finally admitted her odd friendship with Malfoy after Neville saw them in Diagon Alley. Surprisingly, Ron hadn't been very upset. She had actually hoped for a little more jealousy on his part, though she knew that was immature of her. It was good that he wasn't angry. It meant he trusted her. But a part of her wished he cared a little more and didn't take for granted the fact that she'd always be there. Both Ron and Harry had been much more interested in Malfoy's motives behind befriending her than in her motives for allowing it to happen. She guessed that was their Auror training coming through. Ginny pulled her into the theater, and Hermione was glad to be out of the cold. She handed her cloak to the attendant as Ginny studied her new dress robes. I'm glad you went with the navy robes over the green. They go better with your skin tone. Thanks, Gin. And the cut. Very sexy, Hermione. She winked. Too bad we couldn't convince the boys to come out with us tonight. Oh, I don't mind. I won't have to nudge a snoring Ron awake every few moments, Hermione quipped, She looked down at her robes and silently agreed with Ginny. This was a lovely color. She just wished Ron had noticed. Hermione and Ginny had spent all afternoon at a new salon having their hair and makeup done for tonight. The owner had offered to make them up for free as long as they told everyone where they'd gone when they were inevitably photographed tonight. Hermione wanted to decline the offer, but Ginny had convinced her to go along with it, pointing out that Hermione rarely took the time to get dressed up. But when she returned to the flat, Ron had barely looked up from the television and said, "You look nice." Even Harry reacted better, commenting on the specific aspects of her appearance that he liked, such as her hairstyle and new earrings. Hermione sighed. This just wasn't Ron's strong suit. He'd been better at giving her compliments at the beginning, but she knew that was just because of that book about witches. After a few months of dating, when he was finally comfortable, he stopped following the book, and the compliments stopped too. And it was fine. It's not like she was a witch overly concerned with her appearance. An hour later, during intermission, Hermione was waiting for Ginny to emerge from the washroom when she saw Malfoy again. He was a few feet away, staring off into the distance and looking like he'd rather be anywhere else than his current location. She smiled to herself. Why did wizards hate the ballet so much? She tried to catch his eye, but he was lost in his own thoughts. She took a deep breath and approached him carefully. "Hey!" He looked back at her and hummed in reply. "You seem upset." "Your powers of deduction are unmatched," he responded sourly. "I always thought so." He finally looked at her properly and smiled, then sighed. "It's Astoria. She's been cold all night. I assume she's still not over the ice cream date." Hermione nodded and lied. "I got a lecture too." Malfoy appraised her appearance. She waited patiently and studied his expression, suddenly curious to know what he thought and a little nervous that he would actually tell her. "I know you don't like it when witches are valued for their appearance," he started, but she cut him off before he could continue. "You do. And how do you know that?" He shrugged. "You're easy to read. Anyway, I was just going to say that you look incredible tonight. That's a good color on you. And your hair like that, out of your face, it's nice. And whatever you did to your eyes, it's a lovely effect." Hermione tried to ignore the feeling that her heart was floating as Draco Malfoy, of all people, said the words she wished she'd heard from Ron. "You don't look so bad yourself, Malfoy." He gave her a smug look, like he already knew he looked good. Ass. Just then, Astoria came out of the bathroom and linked her arm with Malfoy's. "Ready, Draco?" She gave Hermione a curt nod, then turned away before he had a chance to respond, pulling him along with her. Hermione saw Malfoy's eyes darken, but he followed her anyway. She wondered what was going on between them, then shook her head. That was none of her business, and honestly, she didn't care. Present time. March 2005. Draco's time, December 2000. Draco Malfoy. When Draco left the theater, he appeared back in the bedroom of the house he shared with Granger. She was looking in the mirror and fixing her hair with her wand. He wondered if spending time with her would feel different after that night they'd shared at the beach. But before he had a chance to consider, she turned to him and frowned. "Do you like me or not right now?" He hesitated. "Actually, I don't care. I did not spend all of last night hiding eggs around the house just to miss out." She walked over to him and studied his eyes further, then pulled him to the closet. "You need to change. You obviously can't go to Harry's dressed like that." "Potter?" "Yes, Harry Potter. I'm sure you remember him from school." Draco rolled his eyes and looked around the closet, trying to ignore her watching him a few paces away. He was pleased to see that although his taste in witches had clearly changed, his taste in clothing remained intact. A lot of the pieces in front of him were the same ones hanging in his closet back in his time. He pulled a light blue shirt and dark gray slacks off the hangers, then looked back at Granger and motioned for her to leave. She smirked back at him. "I've seen you change plenty of times." "Okay then. How about you take your clothes off too?" She crossed her arms. "It's not the same. You haven't seen me naked yet." She still turned around, and he watched her for a second, then pulled his wand out from his robes. "Obscuro." "Hey!" Granger jumped, and Draco smirked when he saw a gray blindfold appear over her eyes. "I wasn't going to peek. God, you're so obnoxious." He turned back to the closet and began changing in peace. "Is this the first time seeing my friends in the future?" she asked. Draco turned and saw she hadn't tried to remove the blindfold. "Yes." He finished fastening his belt, then pulled the shirt on. "Okay," she sighed heavily. "You still call everyone by their surnames, except for Ginny. You call her Ginevra, which she hates, and she calls you Ferret, which you hate. And Teddy, he'll be the blue-haired kid, you call him Cousin." "What?" Draco walked to the mirror and inspected his appearance, then waved his wand and vanished her blindfold. She rolled her eyes when she saw him and kept talking. Teddy, the son of Lupin and Tonks. Tonks' mother was Andromeda Black, your estranged aunt. Don't call her by her surname. Call her Andromeda. Okay, surnames except for Ginevra, my cousin, and Andromeda, he repeated back as he tried to straighten his collar. And try to remember to call me Hermione, though it's not the end of the world if you slip up. He nodded and dropped his hands in frustration. What's wrong with this collar? She smiled and approached him and used her wand to cast an ironing charm. We never figured out how to iron your shirts as well as the house elves, she mumbled as she tried another spell. Draco noticed how close she was as he caught a whiff of something floral. He leaned back, suddenly uneasy. And why don't I just summon a house elf right now to fix it? She paused and narrowed her eyes at him. Because you know how much I hate that. She finally finished and rubbed her palms against his chest, then seemed to realize what she was doing and stepped back awkwardly. Anyway, you don't have house elves doing your laundry in this time. You made me a promise years ago that you would no longer order the Malfoy elves to do housework for you. But I know you have some deal with Daphne to have one of the Greengrass elves stop by once a month. She sighed and shook her head. I assume you're paying them, and honestly, I don't want to know the details. Draco didn't know what to say. He looked back in the mirror. The shirt looked better, though she was right. It was not as nice as when the house elves pressed it. She reached into a drawer, then pulled something out, then handed it to him. Perfectly ironed shirts are one of the things you gave up to be with me. Draco looked down and saw she was holding a wedding band out to him. Did she expect him to put it on? He hesitated as he considered what he was doing. He was going to go out in public and try to pass himself off as her husband, and it hadn't occurred to him until now to argue about it. Should he argue about it? A part of him was extremely curious to see Potter and her friends and how they behaved around him, and this still didn't have to become his reality. He was still in control. She was watching him, and he saw her relax slightly when he took the ring out of her hand and slipped it on. What else did I give up to be with you? The photograph of his father sneering in the background on their wedding day came to his mind. She shook her head and looked down before responding. You'll see. When she looked back up, she was nervous. Thank you, she said eventually, for not being difficult. I know in your time you still hate me. Before Draco had a chance to respond, a voice yelled from downstairs. Can you two hurry up? We're all waiting for you to start this bloody egg hunt. Draco recognized the weasel's voice, and a grin split across his face. He was sure the weasel must hate him being with Granger. Had Draco been the reason they'd split up? He hoped so. He was still unsure how he felt about Granger, but he knew he didn't like Weasley. As if sensing his thoughts, she snapped. Try not to be overly cruel. You mostly like these people in this time, and if something slips, pass it off as sarcasm. When they got downstairs, Weasley was petting the cat. The cat scowled when it saw Draco and jumped off the couch. Draco scowled back before looking over at Weasley. He looked very tired, but otherwise the same as Draco remembered. He gave Granger a quick hug, then nodded politely at Draco. Draco had hoped for more of a confrontation. How's Hugo? Granger asked. Weasley sighed heavily. Still sick. Mama's convinced it's nothing serious, but you know how Parvati can be. I tried to get her to join us today and leave Hugo with Mum, but she refuses to let him out of her sight until he's made a full recovery. Are you worried about it? Weasley shook his head. I'm with Mum, but I know better than to say so. He shot Draco a knowing grin, which Draco sneered at. Weasley's expression turned to confusion, and Granger quickly cut in. Let's go. We shouldn't make the boys wait any longer. She pushed Weasley towards the fireplace and turned back and glared at Draco as she hissed, Be nice. Draco was attacked almost as soon as he stepped out of the fire into the sitting room of an unfamiliar house. A small black-haired toddler was wrapped around his legs, and a blue-haired boy was shouting at him. You have to come see what I got in my Easter basket. It's new dragon figurines and a Stitch. Not a real one, since Gran said I'd lose it, but one meant for kids. You need to tell me if it's like the one you had growing up. The blue-haired kid was pulling at his hand now and trying to get Draco to follow him out of the room, but luckily Potter stepped in to rescue him. He bent to pick up the small child on Draco's leg and gave Draco a pat on the shoulder before turning to the other kid. We're looking for eggs first, Teddy. Then you can show Draco your new toys. Deal? Fine. The blue-haired kid skipped over to the other end of the room and picked up an Easter basket, while Draco took the time to study his surroundings. Granger had joined Weasley and She Weasley on the other side of the room and was smiling encouragingly at him. A few paces away was a witch that looked remarkably like Bellatrix, but without the obvious taint of evil and madness. She was talking to Longbottom and Hannah Abbott. They all nodded toward him in greeting. Draco straightened his spine and took a deep breath. He wasn't sure he was ready for all of this. The blue-haired kid was back, and Draco was relieved. The kid seemed to like him a lot. It wouldn't be a bad idea to stay with him today. The adults would be more likely to notice something was off with him than the kid, he reasoned. The blue eggs are all for James, Teddy. Yours are much harder to find, Potter said in a mock, menacing tone. Draco scanned the room and saw a few blue eggs out in plain sight, but couldn't see any others. His cousin nodded back at Potter, then ran out of the room to start his search. A few moments later, he popped his head back in. Are you coming, Draco? Draco shrugged and went to follow him. No cheating, Malfoy, Potter called behind him. Draco shook his head, still at a loss for words. He'd been expecting to be on the sidelines once he came here, not the center of attention. Granger hadn't prepared him enough for what he was walking into, and wondered if that had been on purpose. Draco accompanied Teddy around the house and garden until they had a basket full of eggs. They helped themselves to several pieces of candy that were hidden inside. After finding all the eggs, Teddy pulled Draco into a spare bedroom with toys and started showing off a new set of dragon figurines he'd received in his Easter basket. After a while, Andromeda came into the room and started up a conversation with Draco. He tried to keep it short and vague, but sensed his aunt was picking up on his uneasiness. Teddy, why don't you let your cousin take a break? He must be hungry. Okay, but you're going to watch me fly later, right? Yeah, sure thing, cousin. Draco rushed out of the room, glad to be away from his aunt, who looked way too similar to Bellatrix. He took a deep breath before going back downstairs to join the rest of the group. Granger was talking to Potter, while everyone else played on the floor with the toddler. Draco went to Granger's side, and when she saw him, she smiled and handed him a plate of food. I was going to bring this up to you. Here. Thanks for being a good sport, Potter said, and Draco nodded back at him, studying the food on the plate before finally taking a bite of the bun. He was glad to find it tasted better than it looked. Granger and Potter continued their conversation about some new case the Auror office was working on while Draco listened quietly, a little surprised that Potter was discussing sensitive information in front of him. He never thought the day would come when Potter would trust him with anything. He hadn't scowled at Draco once today. No one had, not even Weasley. When Teddy decided Draco had had enough to eat, he dragged him outside by the arm. Draco left reluctantly. He preferred being next to Granger, since he knew what to expect with her, but it was probably safer to spend his time with the kid. And his cousin was fun, he admitted. He seemed to think the world of Draco and hung on his every word. Draco settled in a comfortable chair in the garden and watched Teddy fly around in pursuit of an overlarge snitch. He could tell the garden had been enlarged to give him enough room to fly. It was impressive spell work. He wondered if Granger had been the one to do it. She Weasley joined him a few moments later, holding her sleeping son. She waved at Teddy, then turned to Draco. We all seem to be aging, and here you are, getting younger. He couldn't tell by her look if she knew about his time jumping, so he shrugged in response. How are you, Ferret? As well as I can be, sitting next to you, Ginevra. She smirked, but before she could say more, the boy started to stir in her arms. She tried to shush him back to sleep. I really should put him down. I'll be right back. She left, and was soon replaced by Potter, who sat next to Draco and watched Teddy fly around for a while, occasionally shouting out words of encouragement. Eventually, he turned to Draco and said in a low voice, He's been asking more about the war. He cocked his head toward Teddy. I still think he's too young for all the details, but Andromeda wants to start telling him little bits here and there, so he doesn't have to take it all in at once. Potter sighed as he looked back at Teddy, who had just caught the snitch and was releasing it again. Draco nodded, unsure what he was supposed to say. I don't know, I wanted to warn you. I'm not sure how you want to go about revealing your role to him. He adores you, but he'll find out the truth eventually. I'll give you time to think about it. We can work out a plan later. Draco's heart dropped. He felt bad for his future self. He didn't want to have to sit this kid down and explain what a Death Eater was and why he decided to become one. Oh, and about your father, Potter continued. Draco perked up. I started looking into him, but I haven't found anything illegal yet. You need to mind your fucking business, Potter, Draco snapped before he could catch himself. Potter looked back at him alarmed, then leaned in and studied his face. Wait. You're not from this time. You know? Potter nodded. I can never tell as quickly as Hermione, but yeah, I know about your, condition. When are you from? December 2000. Wow, early. You and Hermione aren't even friends yet. That must be weird. Yeah, it's a bit strange, Draco admitted reluctantly. Just then, Andromeda came to collect Teddy. Potter and Draco went back inside and wished them farewell. Granger came to Draco's side and leaned in and whispered, Are you okay? Do you want to go? Draco shook his head, and she beamed back at him. Then she pulled him to the couch and continued her previous conversation with Longbottom about obscure plants. Draco tried to follow along, but quickly lost interest. He focused back on Potter, who was talking to his wife. She winked when she saw Draco looking at her. Well, there was the answer to his previous question. Both Potters certainly knew about his time jumping. Abbott came to join Granger and Longbottom's conversation, and Granger moved closer to Draco to accommodate her on the couch. She leaned against him easily for a few moments, and Draco stayed completely still, trying his best not to smell her again. It was her shampoo that smelled of flowers, he decided. He started breathing in through his mouth. After a few moments, he felt her stiffen, then shift away from him. "Sorry," she whispered before turning back to Longbottom. An hour later, Granger announced that it was time for them to go back home. She noticed Draco's hesitation in front of the fireplace and stepped ahead of him, speaking their address clearly before walking into the green flames. Draco followed close behind her and stepped out into the familiar sitting room of their home. When she saw him, she smiled widely. "That was perfect, thank you." He nodded, unsure what to say. He figured it was the least he could do since his last time jump he'd made her talk about the war on her honeymoon. Draco looked down at his hands and saw the wedding ring there. He pulled it off his finger and handed it back to her. "The last time I saw you, I ruined your honeymoon. Did I, make it up to you?" Draco took the ring and pocketed it, then smiled at him. "You did. But that night with you?" She pointed at him, and he thought she meant to distinguish his current self from her husband. "It was really special for me. Thank you for sharing. I feel like I got to know you a lot better." Draco nodded, suddenly remembering his concern from the end of that night. He'd been worried about the fights his future self and Granger would get into later in their marriage, but this date was later than those, so they must have made up. "What were we fighting about a few months ago?" "You traveled to some of that time already?" "I bet I was the cause of a lot of that tension," Draco admitted. She nodded, then her eyes turned sad. The time jumping, it gets hard, but I'm not supposed to tell you the details about the future." They regarded each other in silence for a few moments. Then she leaned in and placed a small kiss on his cheek before turning to leave. "Thanks again. I'll leave you alone for a bit. I know today was probably a lot." When she reached the doorway, he called to her, having finally worked up the courage to ask the question that had been on his mind all day. "We don't have kids?" She paused and turned her head slightly so that he could only see the side of her face. "We don't?" I was asking you." She sighed and rubbed her hand along the wooden frame. When she spoke again, she was talking to the wall. "You're the one who's been to the future." She sounded disappointed, and Draco decided it was best to drop this topic. She finally turned back to him and smiled sadly, then said, "Happy Easter, Draco," before turning to leave. "Happy Easter, Hermione," he said under his breath after she left the room. Draco sunk into the couch and took a deep breath, then started to replay the events of the day. While he was thinking, he remembered something her future self had said to him before one of their fights. "The last time you came from the past, you accompanied me to the Potters for Easter, then apologized for ruining my honeymoon. I guess I was bound to get a sour Draco this time." "Shit," Draco muttered as he dropped his head into his hands. It was all connected. No matter how much he tried to deny it, he was bouncing around on a continuous timeline, not traveling forward to some alternate reality. But is this future so bad? A small voice in his mind asked, and he admitted briefly, as he thought back on the events of the day, that the place this timeline was marching toward wasn't as bad as it could be. End of chapter. Chapter 8. Quote, "It was a question I had worn on my lips for days, like a loose thread on my favorite sweater I couldn't resist pulling, despite knowing it could all unravel around me. 'Do you love me?' I ask. You look up from your coffee startled, your expression frozen, and in your hesitation, I found my answer. Langliev." Present time, January 2001. Draco's time, June 2004. Astoria Greengrass. Astoria was on holiday in Switzerland with her sister, Draco, Blaze, and Theo. The whole trip had been Blaze's idea, and with minimal pleading on her part, Draco had agreed to join the group and even rented a gorgeous ski chalet for them. She wondered where he'd found one vacant on such short notice, but figured with enough gold any place could suddenly become available. Did Draco ever resent always being the one to pay for everything? This was something she never thought to ask, and even if she did, She didn't think he'd answer honestly, though she suspected he didn't care or even notice. The Malfoys were rumored to have so much money that Draco could probably afford to buy this place outright without a second's hesitation. That wasn't why she was with him, though Astoria knew a lot of people thought so, her parents included. She sighed and turned the page of the Witch Weekly magazine she was skimming. Daphne stormed into the room and began pacing in front of the large fireplace. If Blaise brings some slag home tonight, I might hex her. Why her? Shouldn't you hex him? Good point. I'll hex both of them. Astoria sighed and put down her magazine. You need to tell him how you feel. I don't think he knows. I know, but admitting I love him, that would be a disaster. Daphne finally stopped pacing and stood still, staring into the fire. I'll just get over it one day. Will you? It's been, 5 years? You haven't got over him yet. Shut up. Daphne turned back to Astoria and went to join her on the couch. Well, at least stop sleeping with him whenever he decides he wants you again, Astoria said matter-of-factly. I told you to drop it, Story. Daphne narrowed her eyes, and Astoria shrugged. We can talk about my pathetic love life instead. She pulled her legs up under her and turned to face her sister. What do you mean? What's the matter now? I don't know. It's not the Granger thing, right? Because I really don't think that's anything to be worried about. He was probably just trying to make amends, like he did with Potter a few years ago. Yeah, that's what he said, but, well, he only admitted to it when forced. And he never told me about Harry Potter. I only know that because you told me, and Astoria cut off and looked away from Daphne. What? I think he tried to talk to me about it, but I screwed it up, and then he completely shut down. Astoria was embarrassed to admit it, but when she thought back on that conversation, she realized she'd finally been close to getting what she'd wanted from Draco, but had been too stupid at the time to realize what was going on. What happened? He was talking about nightmares, and he seemed angry and annoyed. So I thought he was trying to point out I hadn't been through what he had, but I think he was trying to admit something to me, and I bungled it. She cut off again and dipped her head. Sometimes I think I'm the wrong person for him. Like he needs something I can't offer. No, that's a good sign, Story. Daphne placed a comforting hand on her leg. At least he's trying. It will get better, I'm sure of it. I thought it would be thrilling trying to get him to open up. He's smart and complicated, and I was intrigued by the challenge. He's so much more interesting than any of the wizards from my year, but maybe I'm not cut out for the complication that is Draco Malfoy. Be patient. I think it will get better. I've been friends with him almost my whole life, and I feel like I know about a quarter of him. So it's not just you, but he likes you, and if you give it time, I think you two will figure it out. Yeah, Astoria sighed, and they both heard the front door open. The guys were back from their trip to the pub. Daphne strained her ears, probably listening for a female voice. A few moments later, Blaise and Theo appeared in the room, and Astoria was glad to see Blaise was alone. Where's Draco? Theo shrugged. He said he wasn't feeling well. Astoria frowned, then stood up to go find him. One good thing about Draco paying for the chalet was that they got the best room in the house. Draco? She called. The room was empty. She found him outside, leaning against the railing of the balcony. She cast a warming charm on herself when she reached the open door. What was Draco doing outside in the cold? If he wasn't feeling well, shouldn't he be in bed? She could tell he hadn't noticed her, so she cleared her throat and saw him jump. Oh, hey, Story. When he looked back at her, he smiled, but it hadn't reached his eyes. Are you okay? She went to stand next to him and started rubbing his arms with her hands, but stopped when he stiffened under her touch. Something about him looked off, but she couldn't place it. And his clothes, his jumper was different from the one he'd been wearing earlier. Why had he changed his clothes? Actually, no, he said eventually before going back inside. He held the door open for her to follow him. I'm feeling ill. I'm going to turn in for the night, if that's fine. Astoria nodded back at him slowly. Okay, I hope you feel better. She left him alone, and when she reached the hall, she realized what it was that was so odd about him. He hadn't looked her in the eye. Just when she thought she was getting closer to understanding him, he went and changed the game again. Astoria didn't know how much longer she'd be able to keep up with him. Present time, June 2004. Draco's time, January 2001. Draco Malfoy. Draco was at a pub in a small wizarding town in Switzerland when he time jumped again. He was annoyed he'd have to miss out on his holiday, but at least his future self wouldn't be able to see Granger out. He just hoped he didn't do anything to compromise his relationship with Astoria. He checked the date as soon as he appeared back in the house he was coming to know quite well, June 4th, 2004. Draco had memorized the future timeline by now, so he could be better prepared. His honeymoon had been in May of 2004, and the time he'd woken up in bed with her, and when he first found out they were married, was in August 2004. At their honeymoon, she'd still been very much in love with him, but it was clear in the August jump she was upset, so he wondered what he'd encounter today. The house was empty, and Draco assumed Granger was at work. He settled into the main room and eyed a newspaper on the table, but kept from reaching for it. He could make a fortune if he used his time jumping to better place investments in his time, but something kept him from doing so. He'd already broken enough laws in the war, hadn't he? And the investments were a fun way to pass the time. It was never about money for him. He already had a fortune. Luckily, he didn't have to wait long before Granger apparated into the room. She smiled when she saw him and started walking toward him, then stopped when she recognized he was from a different time. "Oh, hi. What time are you from?" "January 2001. Draco saw her eyes flash with disappointment. She turned on her heel and disappeared into the hall. After half an hour, Draco decided to go find her. Mostly out of boredom, he told himself. She was lying on her stomach on her bed, reading a huge ancient tome, while she took notes on an odd-looking stack of paper. He crossed his arms and watched her in the doorway until she looked up at him. "Hi, do you need something? There are leftovers in the fridge if you're hungry. I know where everything is." "Okay." "You were disappointed when I told you what time I'm from. Why?" She shrugged. "I prefer you from later, after we've reconnected in our time." "And when is that?" She shook her head and ignored the question. "And it's your birthday tomorrow. I had a party planned. We both knew you were going to miss it." She smirked. "You were so annoyed. Anyway, I'd hoped to attend with a Draco that doesn't hate me. I suspect that's why you were cagey when I asked you about the details about this jump." Draco shook his head. It would be so odd on the other end of the time jumping when he knew what days the jumps would come and for how long. He'd even know where he was going. He thought of his future self now, annoyed in the ski chalet and missing out on his birthday party. He hoped again that he didn't do anything cruel to Astoria or his friends. He focused back on Granger. "So, you want me to leave you alone?" She shrugged again and turned back to her book. "You can do whatever you want." Draco continued to watch her for a few moments before asking, "Why do I always end up in this house? Do I never go out?" She closed her book and sat up on the bed, then nodded her head toward the chair on the other side of the room. He hesitated at first, since he didn't like being ordered around, but eventually gave in and sat down when it became clear that she wasn't going to speak until he did so. "You go out plenty," she said eventually. "Today I believe you had 3 meetings for work. We even ate lunch together since you were so close to the ministry. I think you apparate back here whenever you're out and feel the time jump coming on." "What do I do for work?" She shook her head. "We don't tell each other details about our future. Except for the fact that we're married. That would be hard to hide. What do we do? You sit in here and do work?" He motioned towards the book and papers spread out on the bed. "And I..." He paused, considering. "What? Do I read? Do I work too? Or maybe spend most of my time away?" The last option made the most sense to him. She looked annoyed. "Is it so inconceivable to you that we might actually spend time together and talk? I only work or read alone when your past self comes forward. What could we possibly have to talk about?" She glared at him, and he checked that his wand was close, just in case. "What? We have nothing in common. Because I'm a mudblood and you're a pureblood?" Draco shifted in his chair. "No. Well, sort of, but without the slur, of course," he added in a rush. She sighed heavily and rolled her eyes. "Yes, we grew up differently. But it turns out that didn't keep us from having similar interests. And I think we both found things we liked that we never realized we would. What have you found you liked that you didn't expect?" She considered for a minute before answering. "Slytherins." Draco didn't know what to say to that, so he stayed quiet. She leaned over to one of the nightstands and pulled a book out of the drawer, then tossed it to him. He caught it and read the title. Robinson Crusoe. "We both like to read. That book is one of your favorites." Draco glared at it and began flipping through it. It must be from a Muggle author, since he didn't recognize the name. When he looked back at Granger, she had returned to her book. He sighed and turned to the first page. "Why do I like this?" She answered without looking up, but could see that she was smiling to herself. "You found his attempts to survive without the use of magic fascinating." Draco looked back at the book, then started reading, since there wasn't anything else to do. The man in the story went against his father's wishes and went on a sea voyage. The whole thing was unbelievably primitive. Sailing at sea for months with no magic, just to get to a foreign land? Was that the only way Muggles could travel between continents? When he finished the first chapter, he couldn't help saying, "Please, Granger, tell me Muggles don't travel like this today." She regarded him for a moment, then burst out laughing. "What? Those were nearly the exact same words you said when you read that in my time. But now I see it was a joke, since you're reading it here for the first time." She trailed off, clearly replaying the conversation with the other Draco in her mind. He noticed she had a goofy smile on her face. "Granger." She turned back to him. "Right. To answer your question, no, they do not. They don't go on month-long trips via ship. They fly in planes. Those flights last anywhere from 1 to up to 15 hours, depending on how far they are traveling." Draco had seen Muggle planes in the sky, but it had never occurred to him to wonder about what they were used for before. "I never considered how they get around without magic," he admitted. "It's quite remarkable what they can manage without magic." Her eyes sparkled with amusement as she added, "Keep reading." He turned back to the book, but couldn't focus, feeling eyes on him. But when he looked up, Granger wasn't paying attention to him. So who was watching him? He found the source sitting on the window ledge. It was that hideous cat. "The cat hates me," he said matter-of-factly. Granger nodded back at him, like this wasn't news to her. "Why?" She shrugged and said vaguely, "He prefers Ron." Draco could tell she wasn't paying attention anymore, and went back to his book, but not before giving the cat one last angry glare. Draco spent the rest of the night and most of the next day reading the book. There were a lot of things he didn't understand, but on the whole, he found it fascinating. He didn't tell Granger, though. She'd look way too smug about it. Now they were both in front of the fireplace, about to go to his birthday party. She'd just handed him a wedding ring, and he put it on without hesitation. Was it a bad sign that he was getting used to wearing it? He sighed. He could unpack that thought later. He picked up a handful of flue powder, then realized he didn't know where they were headed. "Where are we going?" "Not Manor." Draco started, sure he'd heard incorrectly. "Theo is hosting this?" "Well, it's certainly not being hosted by his mother." Draco shook his head, then wondered if Granger had always been this sarcastic, or if it was a habit she'd picked up from him. "Who will be there?" "Theo, Blaise, and Daphne. Harry and Ginny will pop in to be polite, but will likely have to leave after an hour since they have a new baby at home. And who knows about the time jumping? Harry has known for a long time, and Theo just found out a few weeks ago. No one else knows." Draco nodded and turned back toward the fireplace, then quickly flew to Not Manor. When he arrived, the drawing room looked the same as he remembered. Daphne, Theo, and Blaise were standing at the other end of the room and appeared to be the same too, though Draco quickly amended that assessment. Blaise smiled widely and greeted Draco with a half-hug, half-handshake that Draco had no idea how to respond to. "Happy birthday, mate." Draco nodded back politely, at a loss for words. He was relieved when Theo didn't try the hug move, but his smile was still uncharacteristic. Daphne gave him a quick kiss on the cheek, which was normal behavior for the Daphne from his time, but she broke character when she hugged Granger as soon as she stepped out of the fireplace and pulled her to the edge of the room, chatting animatedly. What had happened to his friends? He looked over at Blaise and saw him glaring at the witches, but couldn't tell if the anger was directed at Daphne or Granger. Blaise noticed Draco looking at him and shrugged, then started in on an explanation of some new campaign he was working on. Draco tried to follow along, but his mind kept slipping as he tried to rack his brain for a time he'd heard Blaise talk about real things like work. After a few moments, Potter and his wife appeared, and Draco watched them curiously. Weasley went to join the witches and fell into the conversation easily. Potter nodded politely at all of them, and Blaise barely registered his appearance, obviously used to having him around, and went back in on his explanation of a maneuver he was planning to discredit his candidate's opponent. "What have I asked you about discussing blatantly illegal activities in my presence?" Potter cut in. Blaise smirked. "We have different opinions on what's considered blatantly illegal, Potter." Potter shook his head, but Blaise did steer the conversation away. Draco stayed quiet, and they kept looking at him for a comment, but he had no idea what to say. He jumped when he felt a hand on his back, and turned to find Granger behind him. She pulled him towards the hall, and he followed her, confused. "You're being too weird." "What?" "You haven't said a word since you got here. Your friends are far too clever and will figure out something's wrong if you keep acting like this. Just have a few drinks and try to relax." Theo came up behind them. "Is this a different Draco?" "See?" She swatted Draco's arm, and he pulled it back, alarmed. "I told you you were being too obvious." "Wicked," Theo muttered as he started to poke Draco in the chest. "Hey!" Draco jumped out of his reach. "How old are you really?" Theo asked. 20. Wow, you don't look that young. He leaned in closer to Draco and studied his face. Are you sleeping okay in your time? Draco scowled, but Theo looked unfazed. Wait, what's going on in your time? I'm at a ski chalet with you and Blaze and the girls. He looked warily over at Granger, wondering how she'd feel about the subtle mention of Astoria, but she didn't seem to care. Shit, wait, you were sick. Theo trailed off as he tried to remember the trip. You stayed in your room for a few days. Yeah, that must have been the Draco from this time. So fucking weird. We should get back, Granger declared. Yeah, okay. Theo turned back to the drawing room, shaking his head and muttering under his breath. They followed a few paces behind Theo, and when they got back, Blaze asked Theo, what were they doing? Shagging again? Draco froze and whipped his head to Potter, who was rolling his eyes. He looked at Granger then, sure she'd be upset, but she just shrugged as Daphne spoke up. That was too fast for a shag. Then she added in an undertone to Granger, even for Draco. Granger smirked back at Daphne, then looked over at Draco and winked. Draco was flabbergasted. He couldn't believe everyone was joking about them shagging so casually. He knew they were married, but still. Granger and Daphne went back to continue their conversation with Weasley as Draco sorted through his thoughts. Granger was incredibly comfortable with his friends. How had that happened? She actually seemed more at ease with them than she did with him, which made a small part of him jealous. For the first time, he was curious to see firsthand how she and his future self interacted with each other. Theo started talking about his lack of success with dating and was looking warily at Draco, but he couldn't understand why. He remembered Granger's advice about drinking and decided that would be a good idea. He went to the drink cart and started pouring himself a large glass of fire whiskey when Potter approached him and muttered under his breath, It's not really your birthday today, is it? Draco gave him a curt nod. What gave me away? You don't normally scowl at me in this time. What time are you from? January 2001. Wow, you two aren't even friends yet. This must feel so strange. Draco shook his head, remembering how Potter had said almost these exact words at Easter in a conversation that wouldn't happen for another year. Yeah, Potter, it does. Present time. January 2001. Draco's time, same as present. Draco Malfoy. Draco jumped back to the ski chalet later that night and found himself alone in the empty house. He poured himself a drink and waited in the main room for his friends to return. They came back an hour later, and Astoria found him first. Draco, are you feeling better? He pulled her close and placed a kiss on her temple. Much better. Sorry about that. He felt her relax against him and let out a sigh of relief. Good, so his future self hadn't done any permanent damage. You going to be up for skiing tomorrow, mate? Blaze asked as he came into the room, and Draco nodded. They all settled in around the fire, and Draco noticed the differences between their interactions now and in the future. Everyone was guarded in this time. They discussed current events, the weather, what they were planning to do the next day, but never delved into their personal lives. He couldn't see this Blaze opening up about the difficulties at work or Theo discussing dating, and Daphne and Astoria were silent, each reading a magazine. When had it all changed, and why? Though Draco suspected he knew the answer to that last question, by the time everyone turned in for the night, Draco wanted nothing more than to be alone. He was annoyed when Astoria followed him into his room, but then remembered she was his girlfriend who would be sharing the bed with him. He was beginning to understand why future Draco had holed himself in his room and feigned illness. It must have been painful witnessing the distance between his friends and his time after getting used to the closeness they shared in the future. Daphne Greengrass. Daphne was lying on the roof of the ski chalet, looking up at the stars, when she heard someone swear under their breath. She jumped up, then looked over and saw Draco crawling toward her. What the fuck are you doing up here? She shrugged and took a moment to recast the warming charm before lying back down. I could ask the same of you. I couldn't sleep thanks to Blaze and his obnoxiously loud slag. Then, well, I guess you'd have problems sleeping too. He trailed off and she watched him settle in next to her and cast his own warming charm. Blaze is an idiot, Draco announced after he finally laid down. At some point, I'm the idiot for continuing to wait for him. Draco nodded out of the corner of her eye. It's a fair point. Why do you keep waiting? I love him. Draco was silent for a few moments, then asked, How can you tell? It was the kind of question only someone who had never been in love would ask. Daphne's heart broke for Astoria. He consumes all my thoughts, waking and sleeping. That, I think, is love. He snorted. Sounds more like an unhealthy obsession. When Daphne turned to look at him, she could tell he was thinking hard about something, or maybe someone. Does Astoria consume your thoughts, Draco? He stayed silent, but his lack of response was enough of an answer. Daphne sat up and looked at him closer. There was something wrong with Draco. He was clearly struggling with something, but she had no idea what it was. Are you alright, Draco? Separate from the fact that you don't love Astoria? What do you mean? He responded, ignoring the comment about her sister. You seem off. I was ill, and I'm feeling better now. Daphne knew he was lying, but also knew better than to pry. Draco appreciated this about her, and likely wouldn't have kept her around so long if she was incessantly nosy like Pansy had been. That was why she was caught off guard by his next question. The group of us, Blaze, Theo, you and me, we aren't very close friends, are we? Daphne was startled and had no idea how to respond. Well, I don't think we are, he continued. That's not really my question. What is your question? She turned to face him, while he kept his face toward the sky. What would it take for us to become close friends who talk about, real things? Real things? Daphne was confused. Draco hated confiding in anyone, but it sounded like he was saying he wanted that. Never mind. Draco stood up and brushed himself off, then started climbing back down the roof. Draco, I'm okay, Daphne, really. Don't worry about me. Are you fine? Do you want me to help you down? No, I'm fine, but please wait and listen to me. He stopped his descent and looked back at her expectantly. I care about you, and I know Blaze and Theo do too, in their own ways. If you need anything or want to talk, we'll listen. Draco nodded and bid her a last farewell before disappearing from view. Daphne sighed and laid back down, replaying the conversation. No matter how many different ways she dissected it, she couldn't figure out what was going on with Draco. The only thing she knew for certain was that he was different, and though she couldn't account for the change, it was clear he was no longer interested in Astoria. Present time, February 2001. Draco's time, July 2005. Hermione Granger. Hermione mindlessly twirled pasta around her fork as the words on the page in front of her kept blurring. She sighed and closed the book. She wasn't in the right mood for reading, which she knew was a bad sign. The past few months had been very hard, starting with Christmas. She'd spent the holiday in Australia with her parents and was disappointed to find her relationship with them as strained as ever. She'd hoped with time it would improve, but they were still on edge around her, even though she tried her best to avoid using magic. Her mother used to be her best friend, and now they could barely hold a conversation. There was too much standing between them. Her father had always been quiet, letting the two women in his life run the show, but now he was more withdrawn than ever. She was worried her parents would never trust her again, and had no idea how to begin repairing that fractured relationship. Then, to make matters worse, Ron wasn't pulling his weight at home. It happened every so often, especially after he spent an extended amount of time at the Burrow. He'd get used to being coddled by his mother, then return home and become lazy with his chores. Hermione hadn't taken up the fight, though, still drained from the few weeks she'd spent with her parents. She'd hoped Ron would notice how down she was and offer to help more, but that hadn't happened. He had noticed she was upset, and he knew it was because of her parents. He wasn't that bad of a boyfriend, but he didn't know how to help her, and she didn't know how to tell him what she needed. She sighed, then perked up when she saw a familiar figure in the window. An involuntary smile came to her face as Malfoy took the seat across from her. She'd assumed he was finished with their lunches, as she hadn't seen him since the ballet before Christmas. She thought maybe he'd decided the fights with his girlfriend weren't worth the trouble. How are you today? He asked with a breathtaking smile. Hermione sat and stared at him, shaking her head slightly. What? She shrugged and looked down at her half-finished plate. I don't think I'll ever get used to you smiling at me like that. Like what? Like, I don't know, it's weird. They sat in silence for a few moments. Hermione glanced up several times to find Malfoy studying her. She wondered what he was thinking. She never knew what he was going to say or do, and she waited patiently for whatever odd thing he decided to say next. She hadn't been sure how she felt about him cutting off their lunches, and when she first saw him today, she hadn't been sure how she felt about having him back. But she decided now that she was happy about it, if only for a distraction for everything else going on in her life. Being friends with Malfoy was infuriating at times, since he came and went without warning and was constantly changing his mood, but she couldn't deny that he was very distracting. What's wrong with you? He eventually asked in a soft voice. As expected, he'd said something completely unexpected. What? What's going on? You seem down. That's... She cut off and looked down at her hands. That's none of your business. When she looked up, he was looking at her concerned. Then he stood up and put his coat back on. Come on. What? No. Malfoy sighed and rolled his eyes. You're so stubborn. Just stand up and come with me. Hermione sank further into her chair. She hated being told what to do. I know you hate being told what to do, but believe me, you'll like this. Where are you taking me? It's a surprise. She stayed seated and shook her head. He returned to his chair. Fine. He crossed his arms to match her pose and smirked. We'll just sit here and see which wins out, your curiosity or stubbornness. He leaned back in his chair and put his hands behind his head, looking at her teasingly. Hermione scowled back at him. How was he able to read her so well when she found it nearly impossible to read him? After a few moments, she got up from her chair and muttered, "Fine," under her breath as she grabbed her coat and stormed out of the cafe. She kept her gaze forward until they appeared outside, knowing she'd find an annoyingly smug expression on his face once she looked back at him. She walked into an abandoned alley, and when she finally turned to face Malfoy, she could tell he was trying to keep his face blank. Where to? She asked, a little annoyed but also incredibly curious. He didn't answer, but instead held out his arm to her. As soon as she touched it, he disapparated them away. End of chapter. Okay, so for the first part of chapter 9, I'm going to look different and maybe sound different because when I went back and re-watched the recording, there was a really weird audio glitch, so I have to redo the first part of chapter 9. So in the middle of this, when the audio sounds different and I look different, it's because it was filmed a week ago. Okay, here we go. Chapter 9. Quote, "Without meaning to, he's disarmed me, with kisses that soothe and alarm me, in arms that terrify and calm me." Langliev. Present time, February 2001. Draco's time, July 2005. Hermione Granger. A moment later, Hermione and Malfoy appeared in the middle of a gorgeous library. Hermione felt she couldn't whip her head around fast enough to take in the room. The stunning spiral staircase in the middle, the tall windows, the beautiful wood paneling, and above all else, the countless books. She could spend weeks there and never get bored. When she looked back at Malfoy, he was watching her with an amused and almost admiring expression. "This is incredible. Where are we?" She froze as she considered one possible location. "No," he said quickly, guessing her thoughts yet again. "I wouldn't take you to Malfoy Manor without warning you first. This is the main library at Knot Manor." "Knot Manor? As in Theodore Knot?" "Yes, but never call him Theodore. He'll hex you. Or, well, in your case, he'd try." She smiled at the unexpected compliment, then went back to examining the bookshelves. "So, Knot is a friend of yours? I never saw you two together in school." "He was a bit of a loner at Hogwarts, but we shared a dorm and became closer after school." "And where is he now?" Hermione didn't hear his response. Her eye was caught by a familiar book on ancient pureblood laws she'd only ever heard mention of before now. She reached out to the book, then paused, unsure if she was allowed to touch them. She looked at Malfoy and he nodded back at her, smirking, then repeated his answer to her previous question. "He's at work." "Oh." Hermione paused with her hand on the book. It didn't occur to her that someone as rich as Knot would have a job. Malfoy didn't have a job, at least not a real one. "What does he do?" "He works at the Ministry in Magical Games and Sports." "Huh. What?" She turned back to the book and finally took it off the shelf. "Nothing." "You were going to say something." She sighed and walked over to a nearby table and set down the large book. "I was just wondering why he needed a job if he lived in a place like this." She motioned around the room. "He obviously doesn't need the money." Malfoy shrugged. "It gives him something to do. Otherwise he'd just waste away here alone in this huge house." She could tell he was a little bitter, but couldn't imagine why. "What?" She stopped herself. It was probably inappropriate to ask him such a personal question. "Go ahead." "Well, you seem bitter. I was wondering why." "I'm jealous. I can't get a proper job with this." He wrapped his right hand around the forearm she knew contained his dark mark. "And is that something you want? A real job?" "Of course." "But you do work with your father, influencing politics." "Sure." "Do you not like it?" She'd asked him this before and wondered if he would remember. He answered as if she hadn't asked before, but his response was almost identical. He explained he preferred managing his family's investments, but that his father didn't approve of him working on that. At the end, he admitted he was doing it anyway, against his father's wishes. That last part of his explanation was different from before. "It sounds rather boring," Hermione admitted and was met with a laugh. says the witch holding a book on arcane pureblood laws. He shook his head and added, "It's not boring when you use astrology paired with arithmancy to predict the best investments. It's like a giant puzzle mixed with a game of chess and, well, luck. Seems complicated." "It is. You'd love it. I'll show you sometime." He said this as confidently as if they had a meeting already set to go through it. Hermione had no idea where Malfoy got his confidence and secretly wished he could bottle it up and give her some. She turned back to her book and flipped through it, then reluctantly put it back on the shelf and went to the other end of the room. She paused when she saw a table piled with notes and open books. They were all on the subject of time manipulation. "Is not interested in time travel?" Malfoy froze at the other end of the room. He recovered quickly, but she hadn't missed his initial reaction and filed it away for later. "He just likes to read. He'll look into one subject for a while, then move on to something else." She went back to looking at the bookshelves, but after an hour of pursuing countless books, she returned to the first one she'd found. Malfoy noticed, of course, since he seemed to notice everything about her. "You can take it. I promise he won't even notice it's gone." "I couldn't." "Then just take it as a loan. He really won't care." "I guess I could. And I could return it to him at work." "No!" Hermione whipped her head back at Malfoy, confused by his sudden outburst. "What?" "Give it to me, and I'll bring it back here." "So, we're not supposed to be here." She looked around warily, as if expecting someone to show up and kick them out. "It's not that. It's... Is it because I'm Muggle-born? He wouldn't like... No, of course not. He's just a private person. Take the book, Hermione, really." She hesitated, but she'd seen mention of this book in so many other texts and had been dying to get her hands on it, and she'd never been good at saying no to an interesting book. She decided to trust Malfoy. What a scary thought. But he hadn't led her astray yet. When they were ready to leave, she paused before taking his arm so he could apparate her back to the ministry. "Malfoy, thanks. I needed the distraction today." He smirked at her. "I know." She rolled her eyes. "You don't have to be so smug about it." Malfoy's smirk turned into the warm smile she was starting to get used to. "Here, let me try again." "You're welcome." "And thank you. I needed a distraction too today." Present time. July 2005. Draco's time, February 2001. Draco Malfoy. Draco's next time jump took him back to the house in London. He wasn't surprised by the location after Granger had explained how his future self would apparate here no matter where he was once the vertigo started. He checked the date. July 20th, 2005. So it was a few months after the Easter they'd spent with her friends. Draco was glad it wasn't a time he was fighting with her. He walked around the house and found it empty. Dusk was starting to settle in, and he turned on the lights in the rooms as he waited for Hermione to return from work. Granger, he corrected. He sighed and sat on the couch, then spotted a Muggle book and a newspaper on the table. He was hesitant about reading newspapers from the future, so he picked up the book and read that instead. A few moments later, he heard the pop of apparition and waited for Granger to come into the room, but she didn't. He strained his ears, expecting to hear footsteps, but it was quiet. He rose from the couch and went to check on her. He heard a thud on his way to the hall and started walking faster. Draco found Granger crouched on the ground, sobbing uncontrollably. It reminded him vividly of the first time he jumped and encountered her in almost this exact position. He rushed to her side and started checking for injuries, realizing while he did so how different his impulse was now than it had been that first day. Had he come to care for her? He pushed the thought from his mind. He would consider that later. Draco checked the reading of the diagnostic spell on his wand, but it was clear. She wasn't physically injured, but there was clearly something terribly wrong. "Granger, it's me, from the past. I can help you, but you have to tell me what's wrong." She finally sat up and looked at him, then leaned her forehead against his chest and kept crying, wringing the hem of his shirt. "Hermione," he said now, hoping using her given name would snap her out of whatever this was. "What happened? Can I get you someone? Maybe Potter?" The last question finally seemed to reach her, and she looked up and shook her head violently. "I don't want anyone else, just you." She looked directly in his eyes, and he knew she was talking about him, the Draco from 2001, and not her husband. The feeling caused his chest to constrict. When she leaned her forehead back against him, he finally brought his arms up and pulled her close. This was an extreme scenario, he reasoned. There was clearly something wrong, and she needed support, and he was the only person here, and the only one she wants. Almost as soon as he wrapped her arms around her, she started crying harder. Draco sighed and tightened his grip. After a few moments, when her sobs eased slightly, he pushed her back gently. His eyes widened in alarm when they met hers. Someone had died, he thought. That was the only explanation for the level of grief he saw there. Who was it? One of her friends? Her parents? He knew nothing about them or their health. He should go to Potter. He knew how to get there, and Potter knew about the time jumping, so he would understand why Draco wasn't equipped to help her. And he'd surely want to take care of his friend. She doesn't want Potter, she wants you. Granger lifted her hands and linked them behind his neck. Then she finally seemed to find her voice. I can tell by the way you're looking at me that you don't love me or even like me, but can you pretend? I need you to pretend. Draco stood still, unsure how to respond to such a request. I need you to love me right now, Draco. What happened? He whispered. She shook her head, then burrowed back into him, this time settling into the crook of his neck. He could smell her floral shampoo and stroked her hair for a few minutes. Are you sure you don't want me to get Potter or his wife? I'm sure. Draco could feel her breath on his neck. When his knees became sore, he shifted and she clutched his back almost painfully. I'm not leaving you, Hermione, he rushed to reassure her, but we should move from the floor. She sat back and seemed to notice where they were for the first time. She nodded and let him pull her to her feet and lead them back into the main room. Almost as soon as he sat on the couch, she climbed into his lap and laid her head on his chest. He sighed and reminded himself this was a special case. If she wasn't completely devastated, he wouldn't be allowing this. He returned to stroking her hair. Draco tried a few more times to get her to tell him what was wrong, but she remained silent and pretended not to hear each time he asked. An hour later, she'd fallen asleep on him, and he realized this was the second time she'd done so. He wondered if this was a regular occurrence in their life. He assessed his options and decided it was probably best to get her into bed. He pulled her close so that he could get a better grip on her, then carefully stood up. When he was halfway up the stairs, he realized a featherlight charm might have been a good idea, but she wasn't very heavy. He gently placed her on her side of the bed, then started to pull the covers up over her. When the blanket touched her chin, she stirred. She reached up and put her hand behind Draco's neck, pulling him down to her. She placed a chaste kiss on the side of his mouth and whispered, "Thank you." He nodded and stood to leave when she added in a louder voice, "I love you." "No," he shook his head. "You love him." The bitterness in his tone surprised him. "I love you no matter the time, Draco," she said sleepily. Her eyes fell closed, and after another minute she was asleep again. He went downstairs and paced, then returned to the room after a while. She was still asleep, and the cat was lying on the other side of the bed watching her. She had the cat for company, he reasoned, so he could leave her alone. But he didn't. He settled in the chair where he'd read that Muggle book a few time jumps before and watched her sleep, focusing on her steady breathing in an effort to calm the torrent of emotions flowing through him. Present time, August 2005. Draco's time, March 2001. Draco Malfoy. Draco never found out what was wrong with Hermione in that last time jump. He'd fallen asleep in her room and been jolted awake once he reappeared in the sitting room of his present-day flat. He'd been relieved to be back and hoped the Draco from her time could give her the support she needed. Then he'd taken a long shower, trying to scrub away the feeling of her in his arms. But that night, as he lay in bed, he was able to recall it easily. Her warm breath tickling his neck, the weight of her in his lap, and how divine it felt to rub his fingers through her soft curls. Stop! That was a one-time thing because she was so sad. He tried not to think about her again, but occasionally, over the next month, he'd find himself guessing at what could have made her so upset. When he checked his timeline, he saw he'd made 2 jumps to the future after that day. One was when he'd walked around Muggle London for a few hours, and the second was the first jump he'd made, when she'd also been crying. That wasn't a good sign. But he decided he didn't want to know the details and tried to push the strange event from his mind. It was unnatural knowing your future. Her future, he corrected. Isn't that the same thing? Stop! Draco was going mad. And to make matters worse, his relationship with Astoria was more strained than ever. She had become needier, and he knew it was because she felt him pulling away. But he had no idea how to behave around her. A part of him felt like he was cheating on her with Granger. No matter how many times he told himself he didn't like her, he obviously cared for her in some way. He'd even gone along pretending to be married to her a few times. And the last time jump had changed something. He'd had a choice to leave her alone. He reasoned later, though, it hadn't felt like it at the time. He could have left her, like he did in the first jump, or he could have gone to one of her friends, but he stayed. And not only stayed, but comforted her. He tucked her into bed and remained in her room so he could be there in case she woke up. He didn't know exactly when it had happened, but his feelings for her had changed. That was a bad way to put it. He didn't have feelings for her. Regardless, it all came to the same conclusion. Draco couldn't propose to Astoria while he had a separate wife on the side, even if she was technically not his wife. But when would it be time to propose to Astoria? This wasn't going to stop, was it? Not if you don't continue your research. Draco had reached a dead end in his time travel research and hadn't been back to Knot Manor in months. But if he was serious about ending the time jumping, he knew he could work harder. He hadn't exhausted all his options. There was still his father to consider. But Draco could only approach him as a last resort. He hated upsetting his father, and admitting to a relationship with a Muggleborn in any form would certainly do that. When Draco time jumped to the familiar house in London, he was immediately assaulted by loud voices and flashing lights. He threw himself to the ground, then sighed when he saw the source of the noise was one of those Muggle boxes. He muttered, Silencio, then Finite Incantatem, but neither of those worked, and the box continued to blare loudly. Draco approached the box, then tried every button on the side until he found one that finally silenced the damned object. He sighed and looked around. He knew immediately something was wrong. The room was littered with empty bottles, crumpled newspapers, and empty food containers. He wasn't surprised when his Hominum Revelio charm revealed nothing. There was no way Granger would allow this mess. Even he was disgusted by it and started vanishing piles of rubbish with his wand. After the room looked a little better, he checked the date, August 2nd, 2005. His stomach flipped. It was only a few weeks after his last time jump. He could find out who had died. He checked the rest of the house and came to the conclusion that Granger had been gone for a while. The cat was gone, as were most of her items from the bathroom. And his future self was obviously depressed about it, watching the Muggle box and drinking and not even bothering to clear the rubbish piling around him. Was it all related to what she'd been crying about? Had they broken up? His heart dropped at the thought of it. Stop it, this isn't your problem. So much for loving him no matter what. He knew that had sounded too good to be true. As he left her bedroom, he noticed their wedding photo. He picked it up and studied it again. She looked incredible. He was finally able to admit that now, at least in his head. He looked good too, in a nice set of gray dress robes. But what made him look remarkable was the expression of complete joy on his face. Like he couldn't imagine his luck at having ended up married to Hermione Granger. But how did you end up with her? He remembered the photo album she'd given him the same night he'd first seen this photo. At the time, he hadn't wanted to see any of the pictures from their relationship, so had mostly ignored it. He summoned it now, then settled back into the chair he'd occupied just weeks before and opened to the first page in the book. There was a photo of him and Granger in some type of library that he didn't recognize, sitting at a table surrounded by books. Draco squinted and tried to read one of the titles, then almost dropped the photo album. They were researching time. Shit. He told her. And then she helped him research the subject. Draco pulled the photo out of the book and turned it around. He sighed when he saw the scribble on the back. 2001. No month. He turned the photo back over and studied it further. They were both reading, and would look up from their books and glance at each other occasionally, then look back when they saw the other person looking at them. At the end of the loop, they both shot annoyed glances at whoever had taken the photo. Draco stuck the photo back in the book, then moved on to the next page. Granger and he were in a museum in Paris. He recognized it, but couldn't recall the name. She was studying a piece of art and leaning in, careful not to get too close. Draco was standing back a few paces, watching her with a soft smile. Granger moved on to a new painting, but he kept his gaze trained on her, never once looking up to take in the beautiful art that surrounded him. Draco skipped over the next few pages until he got back to their wedding. He looked again for the photo with his father and frowned at the hateful glare. He searched for his mother and found her in the background of a different photo, but he couldn't see her face clearly enough to make out her expression. On the next page, he encountered photos from their honeymoon. His heart stopped when he reached one of them facing each other with the gorgeous ocean behind them. They were staring into each other's eyes, completely oblivious to the camera or the breathtaking vista behind them. They only had eyes for each other. Draco felt awkward looking at it, like he was invading an intimate moment between two strangers, but he couldn't look away. They stared at each other, completely still for a few seconds. Then Draco reached his hand to her face and pushed a curl behind her ear. He trailed his finger along her jaw to her chin, where he paused to smile before tilting her face up and kissing her softly. This photo was taken after he'd admitted everything he'd done in the war, but she was still looking at him as lovingly as she had been at their wedding, before she'd known. Draco closed the book and sighed. No pictures of him and Astoria looked like this. Even if he didn't want to end up with Granger, he had to admit to himself that Astoria wasn't the right witch for him. He deserved someone he loved. Like this Draco loved Granger, didn't he? But Astoria represented the life he wanted for himself. To be an influential member in pureblood society, take after his father, be a dutiful son. Did he not want those things anymore? Draco opened the book again, mostly to distract himself from these dangerous thoughts, and was surprised to find a picture of a scene he recognized. It was from his 24th birthday at Theo's house. He recalled Daphne calling one of Theo's house elves in to take the photo right before everyone left. He noticed immediately that he didn't fit in the photo. He was stiff, glancing warily around him, while everyone else seemed to be smiling at some shared joke. Also, he and Granger weren't touching. She was standing between him and Theo in the photo, but was leaning closer to Theo. Draco glared at the image for a while before finally closing the book for good. He needed a drink. He put the photo album on the bed and started looking around for another bottle of whiskey, but it seemed like future Draco had drunk it all. He found a bottle of wine in the kitchen and figured that would have to do. He took a long gulp, not even bothering to conjure a glass, as he imagined his mother's horrified expression if she could see him now. Sometime this year, I will start working with Granger to research the time jumping. Draco spoke the words aloud, turning them around in his mind. How did he feel about this? He wasn't sure. And how would it start? He thought he knew that part. His future self was obviously seeking her out every time he went to the past. Maybe they'd formed some type of friendship by now. He knew it wasn't much more than that, since she was still dating the Weasel. He'd seen a photo of them in one of Astoria's gossip magazines just a few weeks ago. So his future self must confide in her about the time travel, then Granger must seek Draco out in their own time. He wondered if his future self told her on purpose, or if he'd been forced to after slipping up somehow. The real question was, what would Draco do when Granger showed up, wanting to help him fix the time travel? Would he go along with it, knowing it could lead to them getting married? Did he have a choice, or had it already happened that way? Yes, I have a choice. This is still my life. Draco took another swig of wine. He could still deny her, if he wanted to, but did he want to? He thought this future wasn't so bad, but then again, that was before these last two jumps, and there was still his father to consider. Did his future self no longer care what his parents thought of him, or did his love for Hermione simply outweigh those concerns? He couldn't imagine loving anyone more than he loved his parents. He thought again of that picture of him and Hermione on the beach. Did future Draco still feel the same way about Hermione now, even given whatever conflict had led her to move out of the house? Where was that Draco now? Was he with Hermione confessing about the time jumping? How would she react? No, he reasoned, remembering the state he'd found the house in. His future self was likely drunk and in no condition to talk to other people. He was probably just sleeping it off in his flat. Present time, March 2001. Draco's time, August 2005. Hermione Granger. A few weeks after her trip to the library at Knott Manor, Hermione found herself at the top floor of a nice apartment building, second-guessing her decision to come directly to Malfoy's flat to return the book she'd borrowed. She'd brought the book with her to the cafe, but he hadn't shown up, and she was sick of carrying it around. Also, a part of her wanted to see where he lived. The week after he'd first apologized to her, she'd read through his file and found the oral reports from his biannual check-ins. That's when she'd seen that he didn't live at the Malfoy Manor anymore, but in a flat close to Harry's house. A few days before, she'd contemplated going to find that file and look up the address, then decided against it, reasoning that it would be a big invasion of his privacy. Her resolve wavered by the end of the day, and she stopped by the archives and jotted down the address before heading home, reasoning she didn't have to use it. But here she was a few days later, standing outside his door. A part of her wanted to know something personal about him, since he seemed to be able to read her like a book. It might give her a bit of an edge in their future interactions. She took a deep breath before knocking on the door. There was no answer. Okay, well, he was out. She turned to leave when she heard a thump inside, like someone falling. Had she woken him up? She checked her watch. It was 11 a.m. on a Saturday. Who slept in that late? When he finally opened the door, she stepped back and hitched her breath, alarmed by his appearance. His clothes were disheveled, there was a few days' stubble on his face, and he had deep blue bags under his eyes. She'd never seen Malfoy looking so unkempt. Hermione. He was looking at her like he didn't think she was real. She took another step backwards. Hi, I came to return this. She held the book out for him, but he ignored it and kept his eyes trained on her face. You look awful, Malfoy. Are you okay? She could smell stale alcohol wafting from him, and took a second to scan his appearance again. She started when she saw a wedding ring on his finger. When did he get married? Was getting married a drunken mistake? Or was he drinking because he didn't want to be married? She thought she would have seen the wedding announcement in the paper, or surely he would have mentioned an engagement before now. Do you want to come in? His voice was rough, and without waiting for a response, he moved into his flat and held the door open for her, looking back at her hopefully. She took a deep breath and followed him inside as she repeated her earlier question. Are you okay? He was looking at her hungrily, and she looked away, a little embarrassed, and busied herself by placing the book carefully on a side table. She began scanning the room, just for something to do, while he stared at her, but before she knew it, he was on top of her. He slammed her against the wall, but placed his hand behind her first, so she wouldn't bang her head. Then his mouth was on hers, and he was kissing her desperately. His lips were hard and demanding, and she was frozen in place, completely shocked and unsure what to do. He moved his hand from behind her head toward her jaw, and tilted her face up so he could deepen the kiss. It softened then into something more pleasant, and she moved her hands to his shoulders reflexively. When he began to slip his tongue into her mouth, she finally realized what they were doing and pushed him away. Malfoy, what are you doing? He looked back at her confused, then realization came over him, and his expression turned contrite. Hermione, He cut off, as if unsure what to say, then began to approach her again. She moved off the wall and slipped away from him. He didn't turn toward her, but instead bent his head against the wall in front of him and muttered under his breath, I'm sorry. She let herself out of his flat and ran down the stairs, stopping at the bottom to catch her breath. She peered up the staircase and strained her ears, relaxing once she'd confirmed he wasn't following her. What the hell was that? What was wrong with him? Why did he have a wedding ring on? Why had he kissed her? And most importantly, why had she waited so long to push him away? End of chapter. Okay, and now we're on to chapter 10. Quote, There was a man who I once knew. For me, there was no other. The closer to loving me he grew, the more he would grow further. I tried to love him as a friend, then to love him as his lover. But he never loved me in the end. His heart was for another. Langley F. Present time, April 2001. Draco's time, same as present. Draco Malfoy. You've missed the past few board meetings, Draco. Have you been unwell? Draco looked up from his soup and placed his spoon on the table, considering his response to his father's query. Yes, he had been unwell. His whole life had been upended by a broken time-turner and a muggle-born witch. I'm sorry, Father. I'll be sure to attend the next one. It's this Wednesday, correct? Lucius gave him a curt nod, and Draco continued eating his soup, but paused again a moment later when his father spoke again. Is it related to your desire to manage the investments? Draco let out a long sigh. I've told you before that we hire people to do that. You're meant to do more than move money around and study calculations. Draco would typically nod here and remain silent, but something made him speak up this time. He blamed it on all the time he'd been spending with Gryffindors. I'm more interested in finance than politics, Father, and the way I do it, it's different from the money managers you hire. It's more nuanced and interesting and requires more skill. His father shook his head, disappointed. I want so much more for you, Draco, after everything I've already put you through. And sometimes I just want to be happy. Are you not happy now? His mother asked, looking slightly offended. What more could you want? Our family is intact, and you are well set up to step into a prestigious career, serving on countless boards and influencing all the major political decisions of the day. And you have a lovely girlfriend. Yes, Mother. Draco nodded, avoiding her gaze. He felt guilty at the mention of Astoria. He decided to end it with her as soon as he worked up the courage to do so, and was worried about how his parents would take it, especially his mother, who seemed desperate for him to be married. Lucius started talking about the board meeting they were to attend next week, and Draco joined in, glad for the change in conversation. He declined the offer to join his father for a drink after dinner and apparated straight home, relieved to find his flat empty. He thought Astoria might be there. He remembered her mentioning coming over if she got out of dinner with her friends early. It was probably better if he spent the night alone, though he'd have to face her eventually. He just needed to work out a reason to end it with her that didn't include time travel or another woman. There was a knock on his door, and Draco performed a quick spell to reveal who was on the other side. He froze when he saw it was Granger. Shit, it was happening. She must be here to discuss time travel. He took a deep breath and checked his reflection in the hall mirror, then berated himself for doing so, before finally opening the door. Before he could say a word, Granger smacked him hard across the face. Fuck! He pulled his hand up to cover his stinging cheek and leaned against the door frame, slipping his wand out of his pocket with his other hand. What the hell is wrong with you? What's wrong with me? The last time I was here, you kissed me. Out of nowhere. You cannot do that. I don't care how drunk you were. I have a boyfriend who I love. Oh, Merlin, he'd kissed her. And she said he was drunk. Draco sighed heavily. She was obviously referring to future Draco from the last time jump. So, it turned out he hadn't been sleeping it off. Fucking wanker. Granger was glaring at him, her eyes alight with anger, and he stepped back, worried she was going to slap him again. He wondered how it had come about. Had he just attacked her? Had they talked first? How had she responded? Had it been a good kiss? Not helpful, you idiot. Granger, calm down. I can explain. He cut off. Could he explain? He was trying his best to think of a good excuse when she started in on some speech she seemed to have prepared ahead of time. No, I just need to say a few things, then I'm leaving. I don't want to hear your excuses. She began a lecture on witches' rights and berated him for trying to force himself on her. There was some mention of arcane, patriarchal, pureblood beliefs, then a bit about how a proper wizard should secure the witch's consent before initiating any romantic activities, such as throwing someone against the wall and snogging them. Draco couldn't help but smirk at her long-winded monologue, and he found himself wondering which wall in his flat he'd thrown her against. Seriously, stop. She finished her tirade with, I think we need to stop meeting. I thought we were, friends. I mean, we were just barely friends. You must have misinterpreted because, well, I have Ron. Draco cut in then. I also have a girlfriend. You are a terrible boyfriend. Draco couldn't deny that. He started raking his hands through his hair, searching for a plausible excuse for his future self's behavior. Malfoy, this has been, nice. Thank you for the apology and the lunches and the library tour. I'm happy to see you've changed from the spoiled brat you were in school, but I came to say goodbye and let you know this is over. She held her hand out to him. He looked at it curiously, but didn't take it. Right, okay. She pulled her hand back and turned to go. As soon as she disappeared into the stairwell, Draco moved to follow her, ready to confess everything. He stopped short in the hall as he realized something. He was the one who told her everything. He was the reason they started working together in that library from the photo. It made sense now. One thing Draco valued above all else was the freedom to make his own decisions. His future self would have never taken that away from him. So, this was the start of it all. Draco hadn't expected it to happen so quickly. Draco looked at the door to the stairs as his mind raced. He could stop it now. She was done with him, so when his future self came back to find her, she'd refuse to see him. He could stay with Astoria and work on rebuilding what he'd broken there. He didn't have to lead himself toward the life depicted in that photo album. He didn't have to do everything he didn't want to do. But it was a good future, wasn't it? Better than his life now. He couldn't be sure. All told, he'd spent less than a month there, and not all the times had been good. His mind raced through everything he'd witnessed. Easter with Potter and her other friends, his birthday party, the fights with her, all the times she'd cried, their honeymoon, the photos in the album, his father's face, and finally, the last time he'd seen her, and what she said as he tucked her into bed. I love you. No, you love him. I love you no matter the time, Draco. He crossed the hall a few paces and stopped with his hand clutching the doorknob. What do I want? What do I want? What do I want? He thought to himself as he stared down at his white knuckles gripping the knob firmly. Finally, he took a deep breath, pulled the door open, and started sprinting down the stairs. Granger! Astoria Greengrass. Astoria was walking up the stairs to Draco's flat and paused at the top to catch her breath. She would usually apparate or flew directly inside, but Draco had been off lately, and she didn't want to presume he'd welcome her in. If she knocked on his door, it would give him the sense of control he needed, and make him feel like he could turn her away, though she hoped he wouldn't. This was a ridiculous way to have to behave around your boyfriend, but she hoped it was temporary, and whatever was plaguing Draco would soon pass. Or better yet, he'd finally let her in on whatever it was. She heard voices in the hall, and pressed her ear up to the door, suddenly curious. What the hell is wrong with you? What's wrong with me? The last time I was here, you kissed me out of nowhere. You cannot do that. Astoria gasped and moved away from the door. She lifted her wand and cast a charm on it to see who was on the other side. She gasped again when she recognized the witch. Draco had kissed Hermione Granger? Astoria turned back to the stairs, eager to get out of sight. She believed Draco when he said it was nothing. She was such a fool. Did he like Granger? She didn't seem to like him back, so it wasn't like they were carrying on a secret relationship. Had he been pining for her? Is that why he'd been so distant? Then why didn't he just break up with Astoria? He didn't seem like the type to cheat. When she reached the bottom of the stairs, she apparated straight into her bedroom at Greengrass Estate. She walked to the mirror and studied her reflection, wondering what Draco saw in Hermione Granger that he didn't see in her. She stood there a long while, then noticed that she wasn't crying. She didn't feel hurt, she realized. The primary emotion she was feeling was shock. Hermione Granger. Granger! Hermione heard Malfoy's voice at the top of the stairs, but ignored it and continued running down. He caught up with her by the time she reached the door at the bottom floor and yelled, "It wasn't me!" She turned back at him, suddenly angry. "How stupid do you think I am? Do you expect me to believe someone used Polyjuice Potion for the sole purpose of getting really drunk and sitting in your flat just so he could launch himself at the first unsuspecting witch to come calling and later blame it on you? Why did you come to my flat?" Hermione felt guilty, remembering how she snooped through the Auror reports to get his address, but she quickly shook it off. He was the one at fault here, not her. That is beside the point. She turned to leave and opened the door, but he closed it shut behind her. "Wait." She pulled her wand out of her robes and pointed it at his chest. He backed away quickly, holding his hands in the air. "Can you come back to my flat so I can explain?" "Right, so you can assault me again?" A few sparks shot out of the end of her wand, and he backed away further. Malfoy looked up the stairwell as if to check that they were alone. Then he lowered his voice and said in a rush, "It was me, but not from this time. Look at me now. I'm sure you'll notice small differences in my appearance from the last time you saw me. Differences that can't be accounted for with just 2 weeks of time passing." She lit her wand silently, then stepped closer to him and examined his face. He was right. He did look a bit younger. There were no lines around his mouth and eyes. But time travel? The Time Turners were all destroyed following the war. And why would he have come back to the past and kissed her? It still didn't make sense. He squinted under the light, but kept his gaze on her, holding his hand up to shield his eyes. "Can you come inside? I know you're dying to know more, but I won't discuss it out here." She considered for a moment, then gave him a curt nod and lowered her wand. As she followed him back up the stairs, she asked, "Who cast the Fiendfire spell in the Room of Requirement?" He sighed and muttered, "Crab. And what book was I reading when we first met in the cafe?" He looked over his shoulder and paused on the stairs before responding, "I don't know. That wasn't me." He resumed his ascent, and she walked quickly to keep up with his long strides. "Okay. Who was it?" He shook his head. "It depends on the date. Just wait until we get inside." They walked the rest of the way in silence. She followed him into his flat and stood awkwardly near the door, remembering what had happened the last time she was here. "I'm not going to attack you," he said with a hint of amusement, which earned him a withering glare. He sighed and started rubbing the bridge of his nose. She watched him curiously, trying to pick out the differences between this Draco and the other one she'd seen. Or had there been multiple future Dracos? "How does it work?" He stayed silent, like he wasn't going to tell her, and she shook her head and turned to the door. "No, wait, stay. Do you, want tea or water?" "No, I want you to explain this supposed time travel." He sighed and turned toward what looked like a sitting room, then stopped in the doorway and motioned for her to go ahead of him. "Fine, but at least come inside. I don't want to talk in the hall." Hermione regarded him for a moment, then reluctantly walked into an elegant sitting room with a gorgeous view of the city. She sat on a large gray couch and was surprised to find it more comfortable than it looked. She crossed her arms and turned back to him. He was still standing in the doorway watching her, then began pacing the room as he finally started to talk. "I guess you can say it all started over a year ago, when I had an, accident with a time turner. Since then, I've been jumping around in time. I go to the future, and the version of myself from the future replaces me here." "What? That's not how time turners work." "I fucking know that, Granger," he growled. She sneered back at him. "Anyway, the Draco you've been befriending, that hasn't been me." Well, that much was clear. This person was nothing like the Draco Malfoy she'd been meeting with for months. And a lot of oddities about the other Malfoy were starting to make sense. The memory lapses, how he never seemed quite sure how she was going to react when he first greeted her, and how his appearance was always a little different. How many times have we actually met up in this time? He stopped pacing and turned to face her, counting on his fingers as he talked. "We danced together almost a year ago. Then there was the checkup at Malfoy Manor, and, that's it." "That's it?" "I passed by you a few times and nodded, but nothing else significant." "How often does it happen?" "I've tried mapping it out to see if I can find a pattern, but as far as I can tell, there isn't one. but it happens around once a month, and I'm usually gone for about 1 or 2 days." Hermione thought about what he said for a second before standing up and walking back to the front door. "Where are you going?" "I'm leaving." "Why?" She crossed her arms and fixed him with a stern glare. "I don't believe you." "Why not?" "That's not how time travel works. I think you're just trying to make up excuses for something stupid you did while drunk. It was clever, especially mixed with the memory lapses and everything else, but, well, it doesn't change what I said before. This is it for us. Goodbye." She turned to leave and threw the front door open, but before she reached the hall outside his flat, he was behind her, and he grabbed her hand so she couldn't apparate. "Wait, I can prove it!" When she looked back at him, she saw he was chewing the inside of his cheek, as if contemplating something. "There are 5 moments from the war that still haunt you," he said in a rush. "The time you had to obliviate your parents, the day Weasley left you and Potter alone, the day you were tortured, the time you saw the Great Hall lined with bodies, and when you thought Potter was dead." Hermione felt like she'd been doused in cold water. They stood in the open doorway staring at each other for what felt like forever. When she realized he was still holding her hand, she pulled hers back violently. "How do you know that?" she hissed. She dropped his gaze, wondering if he was an incredibly talented legilimens. She realized then her eyes were wet and wiped them with the back of her hand surreptitiously as possible. Malfoy's voice was soft when he spoke next. "You told me once, in the future." "Why?" She still wasn't looking at him. "I've never told anyone before." "Oh, I didn't know that." He was staring at the wall, deep in thought. When he looked back at her, his eyes were sad. Then he seemed to steel himself, and she watched his face turn blank. "Will you come inside?" She regarded him for a few more seconds, then nodded and followed him back inside and took a seat back on the couch. She repeated her earlier question, wondering if he'd answer it this time. "Why did I tell you that?" He sat next to her on the couch and sighed heavily. We're friends in the future." "I sort of thought we were friends now." He looked over at her and gave her a small smile, and for the first time that day, she was able to see the nice Malfoy she'd come to know in this sullen wizard. "I was so confused when I would occasionally see you in public, and you looked at me like you hated me," she continued. "But that was just, well, you." He dropped her gaze and looked out at his hands. "Yeah, sorry, but I don't hate you. So, you time travel. How did it start?" He explained the accident at the manor, and how a time turner broke in his hand, and he thought several pieces were now circulating through his bloodstream. He also explained what he discovered in his research about the way time turners work, and how unstable their magic could be when broken, and his theory about using an extraction potion to remove the time turner piece, but how it wasn't possible without the remaining pieces of the time turner, which he thought were long gone by now. When he stopped, she was considering the problem for a while, rolling it around in her mind. There was something strange about how he and his future self replaced each other. That didn't fit, and she was sure there was something significant about that, but she couldn't figure out what it was. "Wait, you do your research at the library in Knott Manor, don't you?" she asked, recalling the stack of books about time she'd seen during her visit a few weeks before, and also remembering Malfoy's odd reaction when she'd commented on them. "Oh, yeah." He looked surprised, and she thought how strange it was that they each had a relationship with a future version of the other person, with different experiences and memories to draw from. "The Ministry archives would probably be better. There's a huge section on time, which is mostly untouched now that all the time turners have been destroyed." "Oh, I don't have access." "I do." His head turned so quickly she wondered if he'd snapped his neck. He was staring at her intently, and she had no idea why, but she stared back at him and waited patiently for him to explain what had just alarmed him. She should have known better, though. He was never forthcoming with his thoughts, not even in the future. "Are you offering to help me research time travel?" She leaned back in her seat, surprised by the intensity behind his words. This seemed like a very significant question for him, but she couldn't imagine why. "I can fit in an hour or so a week, as long as you're flexible with the timing." He looked at her for a long time, and she desperately wanted to know what he was thinking. Then he nodded and said quickly, "I'd appreciate that, thank you." He stood and disappeared into the hall. She rose to her feet and sighed, figuring she was supposed to follow him. He was standing near the front door, staring at the wall and biting the inside of his cheek again when she approached. "I guess I should go," she said unnecessarily. "I can owl you to work out the best meeting time for searching through the archives." She waited for him to respond, but he just nodded absently. "Malfoy, I don't have to help you if you don't want—" "No," he cut in quickly. "I do, want your help. I'll look for your owl this week." He seemed to collect himself and straightened his spine before opening the door for her. "Thank you, Granger, for giving me a chance to explain." She was almost out the door when she turned and asked, "Do you know why you kissed me?" She thought she saw something flash in his eyes, but in a second, whatever it had been was gone. He shrugged. "It wouldn't be the first time I've kissed someone I shouldn't while drunk. But I prefer we forget about that since I have no memory of it." Hermione nodded and finally apparated back to her flat. It was empty, and she was glad for that, then remembered Ron was out on oar duty and wouldn't be back until late that night. She'd planned to tell him about Malfoy kissing her the next day, as soon as she'd confronted Malfoy about it, but now she reasoned it wouldn't make sense to tell him. Ron would certainly overreact, then probably go find Malfoy and hex him, but technically the Draco Malfoy from this time had done nothing wrong. But could she really keep something like this from Ron? And from Harry? She told him everything. "What do you think, Crooks? Should I tell them?" The cat jumped into her lap and nudged her hand. She petted the spot he liked behind his ears and was met with a loud purr. "I know what you'd suggest. You say I should follow my intuition, just as you do." She sighed and played back her conversation with Malfoy. She couldn't believe he knew about the 5 moments from the war. She must be close friends with him if she'd confided in him that much. Had he confided in her in return? "I think," she said eventually, and Crookshanks lifted his head from her lap and cocked his ear toward her. "I think I should keep it a secret for now. That feels right. Though, honestly, Crooks, I have no idea why." Present time, May 2001. Draco's time, same as present. Hermione Granger. "Okay, I have some ground rules," Hermione announced. She ignored Malfoy's smirk and checked her notes to make sure she didn't miss anything. They were sitting in the Ministry archives, about to start their first meeting, since she'd agreed to help him a few weeks ago. "I assume by telling you now, your future selves will remember them?" Malfoy shrugged. "I guess so. I guess it makes sense that I would remember this conversation." "Good. Okay, first, I don't want to know anything about my future." He nodded. "Second, no kissing." He rolled his eyes, but nodded again. "And lastly, you can't make fun of me or my friends." He sighed. "Not even if they do something stupid?" "Not even then." He rolled his eyes again. "Fine, I have a rule too." "Oh, okay." "You can't tell anyone." She nodded, thinking back to her conversation with Crookshanks. She'd already decided to keep this to herself for now. First, he started reviewing the list of dates he had of the time jumps he'd made so far. "What's this?" She pointed at several passages in the notebooks that were blurred out. Notes from what happened in the future during those jumps. She nodded, glad they were blurred out, then focused back on the dates. "Why don't you know the first 2? There were question marks where the future date should be next to those entries." "I didn't know what was going on then, so I didn't check the date. I think the first one was just over 6 years in the future, since that's how many times I turned the time turner before it broke. The other one, I have no idea." Hermione focused back on his notes, pleased by how thorough they were. "They're all concentrated around a relatively small amount of time." He snorted but didn't say anything else. "Can I make a copy of these? I want to check them later for patterns." "There are no patterns. I've checked them 100 times. It looked like there was one for a while, but it fell apart after my 5th jump. I'd still like to check." He shrugged and pulled his wand out, then made a copy of the notes for her, erasing the blurred entries from the copy as he did so. "Knock yourself out, Granger." Later that night, Hermione was still poring over the notes, determined to find a pattern and prove Malfoy wrong. But nothing she tried worked. The jumps did appear to be mostly random, though, like he said, they happened about once a month. One thing she had noticed, but was trying to keep from dwelling on, was that future Malfoy had spent more than half his time jumps with her. They hadn't done more than chat casually about books and random topics, so why had he kept seeking her out? What about his other friends, or his girlfriend? But it was just lunch. Maybe he was spending breakfast and dinner with them. She sighed and pushed back from the desk, then jumped when she saw Ron behind her. She pulled her hand to her heart. "Merlin, Ron, I didn't see you there." He smiled and kissed her on the cheek. "I know. What is all this? It doesn't look like legislation." He motioned toward her arithmancy formulas. "Oh." She looked down at her lap and chewed her lip, then started in on the story she'd worked out earlier to account for all the time she'd be spending with Malfoy in the Ministry archives. "I'm helping Draco Malfoy with some research." "What?" Ron jumped up from the couch. She walked over to him and started rubbing her hands up and down his arms. "I know it's weird, but he needs my help with this, project." "What kind of project?" "I promise not to tell anyone the specifics," she said truthfully, "but he's suffering from a bit of spell damage, and I think I might be able to help him." "Why doesn't he just go to St. Mungo's?" "They dismissed his case. It's very rare what he's going through." "And what makes you think you can help him when the healers haven't been able to? I know you're brilliant, but knowing him, he probably threw a load of gold at it, and I know, it's hard to explain, but, well, I want to help him. and I think with the right research, I might be able to solve it. Ron regarded her for a while. He was upset, but she'd expected this. So you're going to add this on top of the work you bring home in addition to your actual job? When will I see you? Hermione moved the desk and cleared it quickly with a wave of her wand. No, I won't bring this home. Tonight was a fluke. I'll work on this a few hours each week over lunch. It won't cut into any of my time here with you, I promise. She gave him a tentative smile, and he shook his head at her, but still pulled her into his chest for a tight hug. You're too nice, Hermione. She nodded, unsure what else to say. You know, I always thought people can make time for anything, if it's important enough to them, Ron added pointedly. Hermione sighed and pushed back so she could look at him. His eyes were sad. I'll make time for you, Ron, I promise. Sure, Hermione. She could tell he didn't believe her, but was determined to prove him wrong. Astoria Greengrass. Astoria was sitting on the couch when Draco apparated into his flat. He jumped when he saw her, clearly not expecting to find anyone there. Story, where have you been? I've been owling you for weeks. Daphne said you went to stay with a friend from school. Are you okay? He looked genuinely concerned, and her heart fluttered. No, don't do this. He's concerned because he's a nice man, but he doesn't love you. Astoria sighed and motioned for him to take the seat next to her on the couch. He removed his outer robe and hung it in the closet, then went to join her, still looking at her warily. Draco, I can stand you not loving me. I think we both kind of expected that in the beginning, but I can't put up with you loving someone else, she began. He looked back at her confused, and she allowed herself to hope that it had all been a misunderstanding. But no, she knew what she heard. She needed to stick up for herself, otherwise she'd turn into Daphne, pathetically pining over a wizard who barely gave her the time of day. What? I heard you and Hermione Granger talking, and she said you kissed her. Draco winced and dropped his head into his hands. Astoria was glad he didn't try to deny it. When he looked back at her, his eyes were swimming with guilt. Good, she thought. At least he has the decency to look ashamed. Astoria, that was a huge mistake. I was drunk off my ass, and I have absolutely no memory of it. I didn't even know I'd done it until she came and yelled at me about it. Astoria thought he seemed sincere and felt a little better, but it still hadn't excused what he'd done. Being drunk wasn't a very good excuse. I am so sorry, but I don't love her. But you don't love me either. The look on his face gave her his answer. Though she'd known this whole time, she loved him with her whole heart, but he had always seemed to be looking for something more. Even in the other parts of his life, the work he did with his father, the relationship with his friends, Draco wasn't satisfied with the life he had. Your gorgeous story, and clever, kind, caring, everything I could want in a partner. I really wanted to love you. But you don't, she finished for him. I understand. I guess it's good to know before we end up married. Astoria took a deep breath, trying to hold back the tears that were struggling to escape. Draco put a soft hand on her knee. We get on well, and I thought we'd be fine, that we would grow to love each other, but I think I want... He looked away as if he was expecting the right word to appear in the room. More, she supplied. He looked back at her and nodded slowly. Then a few tears finally started flowing down her cheeks. Oh, Story. Draco held her face in his hands and started wiping the tears away with his thumbs. I'm so sorry I hurt you. That was never my intention. She took a deep breath, then leaned away from him and pulled a handkerchief out of her purse, dabbing her eyes every so often as they sat in silence. How does Granger factor into all of this? Draco let out a sigh before answering. We're just friends, really. But you're able to talk to her, aren't you? He considered the question for a long time, like it was a complicated one. Then eventually he nodded. That affirmation hurt Astoria more than the drunken kiss, and her tears started falling again. When Draco saw her, his eyes grew sad, but he didn't reach out for her this time. I'm so sorry. This thing with Granger isn't romantic, really. It's just, well, extremely complicated. Astoria let out a small laugh. You, Draco, are extremely complicated. I thought I liked that about you, but... She paused to sigh. He cocked an eyebrow at her, urging her to continue. Well, it just turned out to be exhausting, she finished. They both shared a laugh, and she finally stood up and straightened her dress. Astoria put her purse on her arm and held her hand out to Draco. I think we should call it, before you end up hurting me for real. Then you can go figure out this complicated thing with Granger in peace. Draco stood but ignored her hand, pulling her into a hug instead. I'm sorry for being such a lousy boyfriend. You weren't. Well, until you kissed someone else. He let her go and pulled back to look at her. I really am sorry. I know. And honestly, kissing her isn't what hurt the most. You confided in her. And I've been trying to get you to talk to me for over a year." She ran her fingers through his hair, which she realized would be the last time. With a wistful smile, she dropped her hand and gave him a small kiss on the cheek. "Bye, Draco," she whispered, "and good luck. I'll send an elf for my things." She turned to the fireplace and wiped a few final tears from her eyes before fleeing back to Greengrass Estate. End of chapter 10. And this is the end of part 2 of reading through Timeless. Part 3 hopefully will be coming within the next week. Go ahead and subscribe if you haven't already. Follow me on TikTok, and I'll see you next time. Bye!